She had everything money could build and nothing grief could repair. Seraphina Crowell, 30 years old, a billionaire, and the loneliest woman in Westbridge, walked into a veterans community center on an ordinary Saturday morning to collect her missing 8-year-old daughter. What she found instead was a quiet man with calloused hands and steady eyes, who had already made her child laugh in a way Seraphina hadn't managed in 4 years. She should have thanked him and walked away. She almost did. But then her daughter leaned close to that stranger and whispered something that changed everything, and Seraphina heard every word. If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us your city and country. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere. The morning Seraphina Crowell lost track of her daughter started the way most disasters do, quietly and without warning. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of morning where the sky couldn't make up its mind between gray and pale blue. Seraphina had been in the back seat of her car, head tilted toward her phone, reviewing quarterly projections from the Singapore office, before her assistant had even finished pouring the first coffee of the day back at the Westbridge house. Her driver, Marcus, had been transporting Piper to her Saturday art class at the Fairmont Cultural Center, 3 blocks from the logistics company's secondary office, 12 minutes from home, a route they had taken 20-odd times. Piper had asked Marcus to stop. She said she needed to use the restroom. Marcus had pulled over near a small strip of storefronts. He'd watched Piper walk toward the nearest building. He'd looked down at his phone for 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. When he looked up, she was gone. The call came through to Seraphina at 9:47 in the morning. Marcus's voice was carefully controlled in the way people sound when they're trying not to transmit panic, which transmitted panic immediately. "Mrs. Crowell, I need you to stay calm." Seraphina was already sitting forward. "Where is she?" It wasn't a question. She went inside one of the businesses on Garner Street, and I can't locate her inside. She may have gone out the back, or which building, Marcus? It's a community center of some kind. The Westbridge Veterans and Families Center. Spoken to the woman at the front desk, and she says there are a lot of rooms back there. A lot of people. Seraphina told her driver to turn around. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. But something in her face must have communicated the situation clearly enough, because he ran 2 yellow lights getting her there. Piper Crowell had not intended to cause a crisis. She had noticed the Veterans Center the previous 3 Saturdays while passing it in the car. There was always something happening on its front steps, folding tables, people carrying boxes, older men in baseball caps, tall caps, talking with younger ones. It looked, to an 8-year-old with an unusually observant nature and too many quiet evenings in a large house, like a place where people were genuinely glad to be around each other. Her art class didn't start for 40 minutes. She had figured she would just look inside for a minute. The front lobby smelled like coffee and wood cleaner. There was a woman behind a reception desk who looked up but didn't stop Piper immediately. The center held a weekend program for kids from veteran families, and a small child walking in on a Saturday morning wasn't unusual enough to trigger alarm. Piper had walked through the lobby, turned left down a corridor, and found a large room at the back where someone had been in the middle of fixing a row of overhead lights. The man on the ladder had heard her footsteps and looked down. He was tall. Even from the ladder, she could tell he was tall. He had dark hair that was going gray at the sides, and a face that reminded Piper of the rocks you saw at the edge of water, not harsh exactly, but worn down to something solid and quiet by whatever weather had moved across it. He was wearing a gray work shirt with a small embroidered patch on the chest that she couldn't read from where she stood. He looked at her the way adults sometimes looked at children, assessing without alarming, and then he climbed down from the ladder. "You lost?" he asked, not unkindly, just direct. "No," Piper said. Then, thinking about it, maybe a little. He crouched down to her level. That was the thing she'd remember later, that he hadn't just leaned slightly or stayed standing and talked down at the top of her head. He'd actually crouched so they were eye to eye, which felt, to a child whose life was full of adults in a hurry, like someone handing her something. "What's your name?" he asked. "Piper." "Piper." He repeated it like it was worth noting. "I'm Beckett. You come in with someone or by yourself?" "My driver was outside, but I wanted to see what was in here." "And what did you find?" She looked around the room, the rows of folding chairs, the painted mural on the far wall that showed soldiers and children, and some kind of landscape she couldn't identify, the scattered tools near the base of the ladder. It smells like my grandpa's garage, she said. That's not an insult. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. How about we find your driver, he said, before somebody starts worrying. Somebody had already started worrying. Seraphina came through the front doors of the Westbridge Veterans and Families Center in a charcoal wool coat, heels she had not changed out of, and the particular expression of a woman who has spent 4 years ensuring that nothing will go wrong and has just discovered that something has. The woman at the front desk started to speak. Seraphina interrupted her gently and precisely. My daughter, 8 years old. Brown hair, she's wearing a yellow jacket. She came in here. There's actually the woman began, and then Piper's voice came from down the corridor. Mom, I'm here. Seraphina turned. Her daughter came through the doorway at the end of the lobby at a light jog. Yellow jacket half unzipped, completely unraveled in the way of children who have had a perfectly pleasant time, while the adults around them dissolved. Behind her came a man Seraphina had never seen before. He was carrying a tool belt over one shoulder and walking at the kind of measured pace that suggested he was not accustomed to rushing and didn't intend to start. Seraphina crossed the lobby in 3 strides and dropped to her knees in front of Piper, her hands going to her daughter's face and shoulders and arms in the rapid, involuntary inventory that parents run after fear-checking, touching, confirming that the child is intact, real present. You scared me, Seraphina said. Her voice came out lower than she'd intended. Piper, you cannot do that. I just went inside, Piper said, with the tone of someone who felt this distinction was being underweighted. You disappeared. There's a difference. Seraphina pulled her into a brief, tight embrace, the kind that was less about comfort than relief, refusing to stay inside, and then stood up. The man had stopped a respectful distance away. He wasn't watching them with curiosity or awkwardness. He was just there, in the way that very still people are there, present, without intruding. She came back to one of the maintenance rooms, he said. His voice was even and unhurried. She wasn't in any trouble. I figured I'd walk her out once she'd had a look around. Seraphina looked at him properly for the first time. He was somewhere in his late 30s. She guessed taller than she'd registered at first, with the kind of build that didn't announce itself. There was a small silver name tag on his work shirt. Beckett. Thank you, she said. She meant it, but it came out with the clipped efficiency of someone who had spent a decade giving and receiving information quickly. No problem, he said. And that was all. He wasn't looking at her the way people usually looked at her when they realized who she was. He wasn't, as far as she could tell, looking at her any particular way at all. He was looking at Piper. You going to your art class? He asked the child. Piper nodded. It's landscapes today. I'm not very good at trees. Nobody is, he said. Trees are hard. Piper seemed to find this enormously satisfying as a piece of information. Seraphina glanced toward Marcus, who had materialized inside the front door with the expression of a man composing his resignation letter in real time. She gestured for him to wait and turned back to say something a proper thank you, something more proportionate to the situation, but found that the man named Beckett had already turned back toward the corridor. He didn't even ask who you are, Piper observed, watching him go. People usually do, Seraphina said, half to herself. He already knew you were scared, Piper said. He said that's what mattered. She'd told herself she wouldn't think about it afterward. Seraphina had a talent for compartmentalizing, for folding an experience into something small and manageable and sliding it into a drawer. She had done it with grief, after Daniel died. She had done it with loneliness, which was a different thing, though people who hadn't lost a spouse tended to use the words interchangeably. She was not naive enough to think she'd handled either of those things well. But she had kept moving, which was sometimes the only form of handling that was available. She did not think about Beckett Rhodes during Piper's art class. She thought about him on the drive home. She identified the thought, acknowledged it, set it aside. She was 30 years old. She ran a logistics company with operations in 9 countries. She had a daughter who needed stability, and a company that needed her undivided attention, and a board that had been circling her like weather fronts for the past 18 months. She did not have room in her life for whatever small, soft thing had moved in her chest when she had watched a man with calloused hands crouch down to her daughter's eye level like it cost him nothing. Piper was quiet for most of the drive home, which was unusual enough that Seraphina watched her in the rearview mirror. What are you thinking about? Seraphina asked. The center, Piper said. Beckett said they do things there on weekends, for kids and veterans, but the roof leaks and the heater in the back room doesn't work right. She paused. He said it in a regular way. like he was just saying what was true. That's a reasonable way to talk about a problem. Most grown-ups don't, Piper said. Seraphina didn't answer that. At home that evening, after Piper had been fed and bathed and was in bed, with a book she'd definitely fall asleep over within 20 minutes, Seraphina sat at the kitchen island with her laptop and searched for the Westbridge Veterans and Families Center online. The website was functional rather than impressive, the kind built by volunteers who knew what they were doing but had limited time. There was a mission statement, a list of weekend programming, information about donation needs. The facility served veterans from 4 surrounding districts, provided childcare support for veteran families, and ran a vocational training program for post-service employment. The executive director was a woman named Sandra Holt. The maintenance and facilities supervisor was listed as B. Rhodes. Seraphina sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. She was not going to donate money to a community center because a maintenance worker had been kind to her daughter. That was not a business decision. That was an emotion pretending to be generosity. She reopened the laptop. The center's annual operating budget was listed in their last published report, $412,000. Their current funding gap was $62,000, which was the difference between repairing the roof and not repairing it. $62,000 was, for Seraphina Crowell, the cost of a business lunch with a government contractor. She contacted Sandra Holt's office that night and left a message requesting a meeting. She was not prepared for what she found when she arrived at the center on Thursday afternoon. Not because of the building, which was exactly as described, a converted 2-story structure on Garner Street that had been a trade school before the city repurposed it. The rooms were functional. The mural she'd glimpsed through the doorway turned out to be larger than she'd realized, running the length of the main hall, painted by a former veteran who now taught art classes in the same building. She was not prepared for the people. 40 minutes after arriving, she had met 6 veterans, 3 of whom worked at the center, 2 of whom were receiving vocational training, and 1 elderly man named Harold, who appeared to live permanently in the corner armchair near the coffee station and held very firm opinions about the city's current leadership. She met Sandra Holt, who was direct and organized and didn't fawn, which Seraphina appreciated. And then, rounding the corner from the back corridor with a length of copper pipe, balanced over one shoulder and a work order clipboard under his arm, she encountered Beckett Rhodes. He registered her presence with the same quality of stillness she'd noticed before, a brief pause, a reorientation, then something that settled back into itself. "Mrs. Crowell," he said. Not surprised exactly, adjusted. "Mr. Rhodes." She nodded. "Sandra's giving me a tour." "Good." He looked at Sandra. "Tell her about the back stairwell while you're at it. The 3rd step is soft." "I already have it on the list," Sandra said. "Been on the list since March. It's still on the list." Seraphina watched this exchange with the mild fascination of someone observing a familiar ecosystem from an unfamiliar angle. There was no hierarchy in how they spoke to each other, or rather, there was, but it wasn't the kind that derived from titles. Derived from something else. Something about who had shown up consistently. After Sandra was briefly called away to take a phone call, Seraphina found herself standing in the main hall with Beckett Rhodes, and no particular script for the moment. "She come back with you?" he asked. "Your daughter." "No, she had school. She told me about the trees." Seraphina blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Before we walked out, she said she wasn't good at trees." "In her painting." He set the pipe down and leaned it against the wall. "I told her most people aren't. She seemed like she needed to hear that it wasn't just her." Seraphina looked at him. "She's been telling everyone she meets that trees are hard," she said. "Like she's spreading the news." "Good," he said. "It's true." She almost laughed. She was aware of almost laughing, which was itself a strange feeling, a recognition of the mechanism, without quite completing the action. "My name is Seraphina," she said. "You can use it." He nodded once. "Beckett," he said. "You can use that."
No.
"I read your name tag." "Then we're even." Sandra returned. The tour continued. But Seraphina was, in some small and stubbornly inconvenient way, no longer thinking about roof repair costs. That Saturday, Piper asked if they could drive past the community center. Seraphina said they could stop if Piper wanted. Piper wanted. The weekend program was in full swing. There were children in the main room working on some kind of building project with cardboard and tape, supervised by a pair of volunteers. In the small courtyard out back, 2 older veterans were playing cards at a plastic table. Near the side gate, a boy around 10 or 11 was throwing a baseball against the wall and catching the rebound mechanically. repetitively, in the practiced way of someone who does it to think. Piper noticed him immediately. "Who's that?" she said. Seraphina was about to say she didn't know when Beckett appeared from the side door of the building with a second baseball mitt in one hand and an expression that suggested he'd been watching the same thing. "Jamie," he called. "You're going to put a dent in Sandra's wall." The boy turned. He had his father's eyes, that same quality of looking directly at something without softening the look, and he was wearing a Westbridge Eagles cap that was at least a size too large. "The wall can take it," Jamie said. "Sandra can't. Come on." Beckett tossed the mitt. The boy caught it without looking. That was when Jamie noticed Piper standing near the gate. He looked at her with the frank appraisal of a 10-year-old who hasn't yet learned that staring is impolite. "You the missing kid?" he asked. "I wasn't missing," Piper said with considerable dignity. I was exploring. Dad said you were missing. Your dad didn't know I was exploring." Beckett had arrived at the gate by this point. He looked at Seraphina with the expression of a man who had decided his best option was to not involve himself in this particular argument. "He's Jamie," Beckett said. "He has opinions, so does she," Seraphina said. "We have a room for that," Beckett said. "It's called the whole building." Piper had already walked through the gate toward the courtyard. Jamie, after a moment's deliberation that seemed to weigh pride against curiosity and came out somewhere in the middle, followed her. Seraphina watched them go. The sun had broken through the clouds in that half-hearted way it did in late October, generous briefly, then reconsidering. "She does that," she said. "Just walks into places." "I noticed," Beckett said. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the kids. Jamie does the opposite. Takes him 3 times as long to trust a place, but once he does, he's there. "How long has it been for you?" she said. Then, carefully, "If that's a question you're willing to answer." He was quiet for a moment. 6 years, he said, his mom. "Cancer, I'm sorry." 4 years for you. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the courtyard. "It was an accident," she said. "Daniel, he was driving back from a site visit." She paused. The roads were icy. "I know," he said simply. She didn't know why that wasn't uncomfortable, having it acknowledged, rather than navigated around with careful language. But it wasn't. "Does it get less loud?" she asked. The question came out before she'd organized it into something more composed. He thought about it. He actually thought about it, rather than offering the automatic reassurance that people issued like receipts. "Yes, it does. It gets better. Time helps. You'll see. It gets further away," he finally said. "Doesn't mean it's quieter. Just further." She looked back toward the courtyard. Piper was trying to throw Jamie's baseball. She was doing it entirely wrong, arm mechanics completely off, and Jamie was watching with the pained expression of a boy who very much wanted to correct someone, but hadn't decided yet whether they were worth the effort. Then he walked over and adjusted her grip without being asked. Seraphina watched that happen. "You can come back," Beckett said, "if she wants. The program runs every weekend." "I might take you up on that," Seraphina said. He nodded, not enthusiastically, not with the eagerness of someone who'd just been noticed by a billionaire and understood what that might mean. Just acknowledged, filed away. True, she drove home that evening with Piper asleep in the back seat and the October dark coming down around the city, and something she hadn't felt in 4 years sitting quietly in her chest, not happiness exactly, not hope in the word's most ambitious sense, just the faint, inconvenient sensation of being interested in what came next. She'd almost made it to the car the second time they'd visited the center, Piper trailing behind her, complaining cheerfully about losing a card game to Jamie for the 3rd week in a row when her daughter stopped. Piper had gone back. Seraphina turned in time to see her daughter reach up and take hold of Beckett's sleeve, pulling him down toward her. Crouched without hesitation. Piper cupped her hands around his ear and said something. Her voice was low enough that Seraphina couldn't make it out from 10 feet away, but she could seize the shift in Beckett's expression as he listened the careful attention of a man accustomed to receiving important information in low places. Then she heard it, the tail end, Piper's voice carrying just far enough on the still air. "Nobody wants to marry a widow like my mom." Seraphina went completely still. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He didn't look up. He stayed at Piper's level, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even the kind that carried without being raised. "Then maybe your mom doesn't need everybody," he said. "Maybe she just needs one man smart enough to see what everybody else missed." Piper's face, Seraphina saw it happen, saw the small worried line between her daughter's brows dissolve into the widest, most uncomplicated smile the child had worn in years, when open and bright in the way of someone who has just received an answer they didn't know they were hoping for. Beckett straightened up. He hadn't looked toward Seraphina. He seemed to assume she hadn't heard. He was wrong. Seraphina Crowell, who had negotiated with heads of state and restructured a debt portfolio in 48 hours and delivered a eulogy at 36 without her voice breaking once, stood on the sidewalk outside a Veterans Community Center in Westbridge and found, for the first time in recent memory, that she had absolutely nothing to say. She stood there a moment longer. The wind moved. Somewhere inside, Harold was arguing with Sandra about the coffee. Then Piper came skipping back and took her hand, and they walked to the car together, and Seraphina kept her eyes straight ahead and her face arranged into something ordinary. But her hand, holding her daughter's hand, was not quite steady, and for the first time in 4 long years, she didn't try to make it stop. She had not intended to go back a third time. That was the truth, and Seraphina Crowell was rigorous about truth, at least with herself, even when it was inconvenient. She had told herself the second visit was about Piper, about letting her daughter have something ordinary and uncomplicated, a place where no one treated her like a liability to be managed. She had told herself the donation was a business decision, the kind of community investment that reflected well on a company's public profile. She had told herself a lot of things in the 2 weeks following that Saturday on the sidewalk, and she had believed approximately none of them. She went back the third time on a Tuesday alone, under the reasonable pretext of finalizing the paperwork with Sandra Holt regarding the foundation's contribution. The paperwork took 20 minutes. She stayed for 2 hours. Sandra walked her through the vocational training wing, where 8 veterans were learning welding, electrical work, and HV certification through a partnership with a local trade school. One of them, a woman named Carla who had served 2 tours before a knee injury ended her service, was explaining torque settings to the man beside her with the patience of someone who had taught the same thing before and didn't mind teaching it again. Seraphina stood in the doorway and watched without interrupting. "She'll have her certification by February," Sandra said quietly. "She's already got a contractor interested in hiring her." "What did she do before the center?" Seraphina asked. "Gas station. Night shift." Sandra said it without inflection, which was its own kind of emphasis. Seraphina looked at Carla at her steady hands, careful way she talked to the man beside her, without making him feel corrected, and thought about the distance between a gas station night shift and a welding certification, and the 2 tours that had happened between them, and all the places that distance might have been shorter if someone had looked up sooner. She wrote a second check before she left, a larger one. Sandra stared at it. "This is Seraphina. The HVAC program needs equipment," Seraphina said. "I looked at your supply list. Don't argue with me about it." Sandra didn't argue, but she looked at Seraphina the way people sometimes looked at things that had surprised them into silence, and that was its own kind of argument. On her way out, she passed the main maintenance room. The door was open. Beckett was inside, on his back on the floor beneath a workbench, doing something to the plumbing with a wrench, visible from the shins down. His boots were scuffed at the toe. There was a radio on the shelf above the workbench, playing something low and instrumental that she couldn't identify. She had almost walked past when he said, without coming out from under the bench, "Sandra make you write another check?" Seraphina stopped. "Is it that obvious?" "She has a look," he said, right before she shows someone the supply list. The HVAC program needed equipment. It did, he agreed. 3 months ago it needed it. 6 months ago it needed it. There was the sound of a wrench turning, then something that might have been a pipe expressing its displeasure. "I put in for a grant in April. Heard back in September. Not enough." "How much was the gap?" he told her. It was a number Seraphina could have covered without looking at her balance. She said nothing about that. She'd already written the check. Saying so would have felt like keeping score. "You do the grant applications yourself?" she asked. "Sandra does most of them. I do the ones that need facilities documentation." He came out from under the bench, sat up and looked at her. There was grease on his forearm and what might have been plaster dust on the shoulder of his shirt. "Why?" "You have access to my company's grants coordinator if you want it. She's helped 8 nonprofits in the district this year." He looked at her for a moment, not suspiciously more the way someone looks at an offer when they're trying to determine what it costs. "No strings," Seraphina said, before he could ask. "I wasn't going to ask, you were thinking it." He considered this. "Yeah," he said, "I was." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. "I'll mention it to Sandra. It's her call." "Of course." She left. She was halfway to her car before she recognized the feeling in her chest as something adjacent to frustration, not at him. Exactly. But at the way he handled every gesture she made as though it needed to be inspected before it was accepted, as though generosity and ulterior motive were so frequently the same thing in his experience that he had stopped distinguishing between them on the first pass. She was also, somewhere beneath that frustration, obscurely glad that he was that way. She didn't examine that too carefully. The Saturday program had become, without anyone formally deciding it, a fixture in Piper's week. Seraphina recognized the transition not in any single moment, but in an accumulation of small evidence. The way Piper stopped asking whether they were going and started asking what time they were leaving. The way she had started keeping a spare jacket in the car because she'd learned the center's back courtyard was cold in the morning. The way she'd begun referring to Jamie not as that boy or Beckett's son, but simply as Jamie. The way you referred to a fact of life. For Piper, it was the first uncomplicated thing she'd had in years. That was Seraphina's private assessment, arrived at quietly one Sunday evening, while she stood at the kitchen window, watching her daughter sit at the dining table drawing a picture that involved, based on the narration Piper was providing to herself, some kind of tournament. Seraphina didn't know what kind. She hadn't wanted to interrupt. The sight of her daughter narrating her own artwork to herself in a low, absorbed voice was something she'd been unconsciously afraid had been lost, that particular quality of childhood concentration that exists before children learn to self-monitor. Before they learn that someone is always watching and adjust themselves accordingly. Piper had had too much of that. The house was large and quiet and staffed, and Seraphina's work hours had been long and irregular, and her daughter had responded by becoming small and careful and observant in ways that had made the pediatrician say she was very mature for her age, in a tone that was complimentary only on the surface. At the center, with Jamie, Piper was just 8. She argued about board games with the unreasonable conviction of someone who has never questioned her own interpretation of the rules. She burnt pancakes on the mornings. Sandra let them use the kitchen and ate them anyway without comment. She had lost 3 baseballs over the center's back fence and felt no apparent guilt about it. She was, in short, a child, which was a thing she had not consistently been permitted to be. Seraphina watched all of this and felt something that was partly gratitude and partly grief for the time that had passed before it, and did not say any of this out loud to anyone. She might have said it to Daniel. He would have understood without needing the whole explanation. That was the particular cruelty of losing the person who required the least explanation, all the things that couldn't be abbreviated afterward. Beckett didn't treat her differently. This was the thing she kept returning to, the fact that kept refusing to be ordinary, no matter how many times she turned it over. She was accustomed to a certain response when people became aware of who she was, a subtle recalibration, a new quality of attention, a shift in how questions were phrased and how quickly her answers were agreed with. It wasn't always calculated. Some of it was simply human. Money and power changed the acoustics of a room, and most people adjusted to the new acoustics automatically, the way you adjusted your voice in a cathedral without deciding to. Beckett did not adjust. He spoke to her the same way he spoke to Harold in the corner armchair, and Sandra in the administrative office, and Carla in the welding room directly, without decoration, with the particular economy of someone who had learned somewhere that the cleaner the sentence, the harder it was to misunderstand. He disagreed with her twice in the first 3 weeks of regular acquaintance, once about the best way to handle the center's heating system. He was right. She acknowledged it without difficulty. And once about whether Piper should be allowed to join Jamie's baseball throws without protective gear. She was right. He acknowledged it with slightly more difficulty, but acknowledged it nonetheless. He refused to let her buy him coffee when she'd stopped by on a weekday. "I've got a pot in the back," he said, and that was the end of it. He refused the gift basket her assistant had sent, through Sandra, to the maintenance staff for the holidays. He'd redirected it to the veterans who used the center's meal program and sent Seraphina a brief, neutral email via Sandra's address. "The guys on the meal program will get more use out of it. Thank you for thinking of them." He sent it back, Seraphina said to her assistant, Diane, with a quality of bewilderment she didn't entirely bother to conceal. Diane, who had worked for Seraphina for 5 years, and had accordingly developed an extremely precise reading of her moods, said carefully, "The basket, or the basket." "Ah." Diane considered this. "Do you want me to, what would you like me to do?" Seraphina thought about it for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "He's right. Leave it." Diane's expression remained professional. Seraphina caught the faintest suggestion of something at the corner of her mouth, and decided not to address it. It was during the third week of November that Piper made her announcement. They were driving home from the center on a Saturday afternoon. The city was gray and damp, the kind of late fall where the trees had given up, and the Christmas decorations hadn't started yet, leaving everything in a lull between one thing and the next. Piper was in the back seat with Jamie's baseball cap, which she had somehow acquired and showed no sign of returning. "I think we should have them for dinner," Piper said. Seraphina kept her eyes on the road. "Who?" "Beckett and Jamie." We have a big table," Piper said. "We never use the whole thing. We use parts of it. I use one end, and you use the other end, and there are 8 chairs, and it's a lot of empty chairs." Seraphina changed lanes. "Piper, I'm just saying."
"I know what you're saying."
Piper was quiet for approximately 30 seconds, which was near the upper limit of her patience for silences she found unproductive. "Jamie says Beckett makes really bad pancakes, but he eats them anyway because Beckett tries." Seraphina said nothing. "I think that's kind of nice," Piper said. "Eating something bad because someone tried." She moved past the windows. Seraphina thought about her house, the large, quiet rooms, the kitchen island where she ate most evenings standing up because sitting down at the table alone had a quality she hadn't managed to make peace with. She thought about the 8 chairs and the empty ends of the table, and the way Piper had said, kind of nice with the tone of someone who had thought about it at considerable length and arrived at a modest conclusion. "I'll think about it," she said. Piper appeared to accept this, which meant she'd decided it was yes. She was not entirely wrong. Seraphina did not extend the dinner invitation the following week. She was in Singapore for 3 days, and then in a board meeting that lasted 11 hours, with breaks only for coffee, and then reviewing a contract dispute that was threatening to hold up their Rotterdam hub for 6 weeks. By the time she resurfaced into something resembling a normal schedule, it was the first week of December, and Piper had taken matters into her own hands by informing Jamie directly, at the center, that they were coming to their house for dinner Saturday. Jamie had apparently said, "Did anyone ask my dad?" Piper had said, "I'm asking now." She had then come and found Seraphina to report that they were having guests Saturday, which was technically after the fact, but still felt, in Piper's interpretation, like the correct sequence of events. Seraphina had gone to find Beckett. He was in the courtyard, reattaching a section of fence that had come loose in last week's wind. His jacket was unzipped despite the cold, which was a habit she'd noticed he ran warm. Or he simply didn't register cold the way other people did. Or he'd spent enough years in conditions where cold was a matter of survival rather than comfort, and had permanently recalibrated. "My daughter apparently invited yours to dinner Saturday," he said, before she could speak. "Your son," she corrected. He turned and looked at her.
"My son."
"Right, a pause. She told Jamie it was already decided. She told me the same thing." He set down his tools and straightened. "I can tell him no. It doesn't have to be a thing." "It doesn't have to be," she agreed. "But you can come if you want to." He looked at her with that particular expression, the one she'd catalogued privately as assessing, without deciding, and said nothing for a moment. "What time?" he asked. 7. We'll bring something." "You don't have to." "We'll bring something," he said, and picked his tools back up. They brought cornbread. It was, Seraphina noted, genuinely excellent cornbread, which she had not expected and did not know what to do with. Beckett set it on the kitchen island with the unceremonious placement of someone delivering a tool rather than presenting a gift, and Jamie immediately asked if they could eat it before dinner, and Beckett said no, and Jamie said that was the same answer as always, and Beckett said yes, and Jamie appeared to consider this a substantive conversation. Piper gave Jamie the full tour of the house, which took 11 minutes and included a detailed account of every room's purpose, and several of its deficiencies, which she offered without embarrassment. The upstairs bathroom light flickered. Her bedroom closet door didn't close all the way. The garden in back was supposed to look nice, but kind of just looks like someone tried and gave up. "Whose garden is it?" Jamie asked. "Mom's assistant got someone to design it, but nobody actually goes out there." "Why not?" Piper thought about this seriously. "I think because it doesn't look like something you'd actually use. It looks like something you'd photograph." Jamie had seemed to find this an entirely reasonable observation, and they'd moved on. The dinner itself was imperfect in all the ways a dinner between two families who don't yet know each other's rhythms tends to be. Seraphina's housekeeper, Mrs. Park, had made a proper meal: roasted chicken, vegetables, the cornbread, a soup, and the table was set correctly, and the lighting was correct. And for the first 15 minutes, it had the quality of a meeting that had been scheduled rather than chosen. Then Jamie knocked over his water glass. He'd been reaching across the table for the breadbasket, misjudged the distance, and his elbow caught the glass cleanly. Water spread across the tablecloth and onto his lap, and he sat back in his chair with the rigid stillness of a child bracing for a reaction. Beckett had already reached for his napkin. He didn't say anything. He mopped the water with the calm efficiency of a man who had dealt with worse and handed Jamie a dry napkin for his lap. That was it. No sigh, no pointed look, no commentary. Jamie's shoulders came down from around his ears. "I did that same thing last week," Piper announced. "I knocked over the soup." "The whole bowl?" Jamie asked. "Most of it. Mrs. Park said it was fine, but I could tell it wasn't completely fine." "It happens," Beckett said. He looked at Mrs. Park, who had appeared to deal with the tablecloth. "Sorry about the cloth." "Nothing that won't wash, Mrs." Park said with the particular warmth of someone who had just revised their opinion of a guest upward. After that, the dinner stopped being a meeting and became something else, not easy exactly, because nothing new was easy, but real in the way that required imperfection to get there. Beckett and Seraphina talked about the center's upcoming annual report, about the vocational program, about a partnership proposal with a contractor that Sandra was considering. They talked around the edges of larger things. They did not talk about Daniel or about Beckett's wife. They didn't need to, not yet. The absence of those conversations was itself a kind of acknowledgement the way you left a door closed, not because it was sealed, but because there would be time. Across the table, Jamie and Piper were arguing about whether baseball or soccer required more skill, a debate that had no resolution, and both of them knew it, and neither of them intended to stop. "Can't argue with the stats," Jamie said. "You can if the stats don't count everything," Piper said. "That's not how stats work." "That's exactly how stats work. My mom uses stats for the company, and she says they always leave something out." Jamie looked at Seraphina. "Is that true?" Seraphina, who had been listening with one ear while talking to Beckett, said, "Every dataset has gaps. Why you use multiple sources." Jamie considered this. "Okay," he said to Piper, "but baseball still has better stats." "That doesn't prove anything," Piper said. "That just proves there are more of them." Beckett, beside Seraphina, said quietly, "She's going to be a problem." "She already is," Seraphina said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to a full one, not the beginning of a smile, which she'd seen several times, but the actual article, briefly, before it folded back into something more reserved. She filed it away without deciding what to do with it. The trouble began the way. Trouble usually does in the lives of people who have forgotten they have enemies, not with a confrontation, but with a document. Seraphina received it on a Monday morning in the second week of December, forwarded by a board member named Patricia Osi, with a brief, carefully worded note. "Seraphina, you should know this is circulating. I'm not the source. I thought you deserved to see it before the Thursday meeting." The document was 12 pages. It had no authorship listed. Its cover page read, in clean, professional typeface, "A review of leadership stability and fiduciary concerns, Crowell Logistics Q3, Q4. She read it twice, once quickly and once slowly, before she called Diane into the office. "Close the door," she said. Diane closed it and sat down and looked at Seraphina with the expression of someone who understood from the quality of the room that this was serious. "Someone has compiled a document about me," Seraphina said. "They're characterizing the personal foundation I'm setting up as an unauthorized use of company resources. They're citing my schedule irregularities since October as evidence of distraction from fiduciary duties. They've included," she paused, because the next item still made something cold move through her, "they've included photographs. Of the community center. Of me arriving and leaving. Timestamps." Diane was very still. "That's not board meeting material," she said. "That's surveillance." "Yes," Seraphina said. "That's what it is." She already knew where it had come from. She had known before she'd finished the first read. Alistair Vane had been on the board for 9 years. He had been her late husband's initial investor, a fact that had purchased him a loyalty from Daniel that he had, in the years since Daniel's death, slowly miscalculated as transferable to Seraphina. He was 63 years old and had spent those 9 years on the board with the patience of someone who considered himself an inevitability. His son, Elliot, was 34 and worked in private equity with the combination of credentials and mediocrity that characterized men who had always had someone to open doors. Alistair wanted Elliot married into the company. He had made this plain enough. In that way, powerful men made things plain, not stated, merely arranged, the way furniture was arranged, so that all the paths through the room led to the same chair. Seraphina had not sat in the chair. She had moved the furniture. And so the document existed. Don't respond to it before Thursday, she told Diane. Pull everything, every receipt, every schedule, every board communication for the last 6 months. I want it organized by date. Already in motion, Diane said. And get Marcus to check the car's route logs. I want to know exactly when we've been followed. She stood. And don't say anything to anyone about this yet. Not a word. Diane nodded and left. Seraphina sat for a moment in the quiet office, high above Westbridge, and looked out at the city with the specific focus of someone identifying the distance between where they were and where the threat was coming from. She was not afraid. She was, if anything, very clear. Clarity was her best state, the state she'd been operating in since she was 22 and had watched her mother's small business be swallowed by a creditor who counted on women not knowing what was in their contracts. Seraphina had made it her business to know what was in every contract, to understand the machinery so completely that no one could tell her something was fixed when it was broken. Someone had been watching her, timing her movements, building a case. What she did not know yet was how far it extended, whether it was just documents and photographs, or whether it was something else, whether the photographs were only of her. She opened her phone and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back down. She wasn't ready to make that call, yet the call that would require saying out loud that she was worried, which was different from being worried, and which made it real in a new way. She would make it soon, but not yet. She was at the center the following Saturday when Beckett told her. Not everything. He didn't have everything yet, but enough. They were in the courtyard, the kids inside because it had gotten cold quickly, the sky the color of old concrete. He'd been carrying a box of ceiling tiles to the storage room and had set it down when he came out, and for a moment he'd just stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the back gate. Someone's been parked on Garner Street, he said. Seraphina looked at him. Different car, same guy. I noticed him 3 weeks ago. Thought he was waiting for someone the first time. He kept his eyes on the gate. Second time I walked past and got the plate. Third time I had a friend of mine run it. He paused. Car is registered to a security contractor called Meridian Private Services. They're not a surveillance firm. On paper, they call themselves executive protection consultants. Who hired them? Seraphina asked, though she already had a working answer. I don't know yet, he said, but they've been watching the entrance, logging arrivals. He looked at her then directly. Piper's arrival time specifically. I've seen him photograph the car. Something cold and specific settled in Seraphina's chest. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise, confirmation. How long have you known? She asked. I've been sure for about a week. Before that, I wasn't sure enough to say. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I wanted to be sure, he said. You don't tell someone their kid might be being watched based on a car and a gut feeling. You wait until you have something real. She looked at him. In the past 8 years of running her company, she had employed 4 different security teams. All of them had extensive credentials. None of them had noticed the car on Garner Street. This isn't random, he said. Somebody who knows your schedule, knows when Piper's here, knows when to be visible enough to make you uneasy, but not visible enough to be provable. That's deliberate. I know who it is, she said. He waited. She told him not everything, not the document, not the board meeting, but the shape of it. Alistair. The pressure. The marriage he'd been engineering for years. The way it had escalated in the months since she'd started restructuring the board's authority over operational decisions. Beckett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Trying to scare you, he said. Not hurt you. Scare you into making a decision he wants. I know. The surveillance of Piper is the pressure point. He wants you to feel like she's exposed. He said it flatly, the way you state a tactical reality before deciding what to do about it. He's read you right. He knows the company is the second thing. She's the first. Yes, Seraphina said. He said, I can keep a closer eye when she's here. I know this building, every entrance, every sight line. I'm here every Saturday anyway. She looked at him. That's not your job. No, he agreed, it's not. She understood then the distinction he was making. That it wasn't an obligation he was offering, but something else, a choice, stated simply, without making a production of it. She had grown very unaccustomed to that. Be careful, she said. He has resources. So do I, he said. Different kind. Picked up the box of ceiling tiles and went back inside. Seraphina stayed in the courtyard a moment longer, hands in her pockets, looking at the back gate. The wind moved through the bare branches of the 3 trees that lined the fence. She thought about Piper inside, losing a board game with a 10-year-old boy who was his father's son, down to the way he held his chin when he was thinking. She thought about the photograph in the document, the timestamp, the angle, the patient framing of it. She thought about a man with calloused hands who had noticed what a team of professional security consultants had missed. Then she went inside because her daughter was calling for her about something, and the ceiling tiles needed to go on the shelf. And outside on Garner Street, the afternoon was going dark and cold, and whatever was coming next had already been set in motion by people who had counted on her not seeing it. They had miscounted. The board meeting on Thursday went the way Seraphina had expected it to go, which was to say it went badly, and she had been prepared for every specific variety of badly that materialized. Alistair Vane arrived 8 minutes late, which was itself a statement, a small, calculated discourtesy designed to establish that the meeting's urgency was hers, not his. He was 63 and looked it in the way that men of a certain wealth and confidence tended to look their age, settled into it, unhurried by it, wearing it like something that had been tailored. He had silver hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades being listened to and had stopped noticing that he expected it. He sat down across the table from Seraphina, set his hands flat on the surface, and said nothing. He let one of the other board members, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been on Alistair's side of most votes for 4 years, open the conversation. Gerald said, with careful neutrality, "We've all had a chance to review the document that was circulated. Before the full board discussion, Seraphina, we thought it was appropriate to give you an opportunity to address the concerns raised." "Which concerns specifically?" Seraphina said. Gerald glanced at his papers. "The allocation of company resources toward the personal charitable foundation. The suggestion that operational decision-making has been, and I'm quoting here, demonstrably affected by personal distraction and emotional instability since Q3. Emotional instability, Seraphina repeated. She said it the way she might have read a label on something she'd found at the back of a cabinet, noting it, not reacting to it. Gerald shifted in his chair. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. The document is unsigned, Seraphina continued, which means whoever produced it was unwilling to attach their name to its claims. I want that noted for the record. She looked at Patricia Osei, who was the board secretary, and gave a small nod. Second, the foundation's startup resources were drawn from my personal equity, not company accounts, which is documented in filings that my legal team will provide to all of you before close of business today. Third, my operational performance in Q3 and Q4 revenue figures, contract completions, the Rotterdam Hub resolution is also documented, and also going to your inboxes today. She paused. As for the photographs and the timestamps, I'd like someone in this room to explain to me how an unsigned private document came to include surveillance photographs of my daughter's weekend schedule. Because I'd like to understand who authorized that. And I'd like to understand why no one in this room thought to raise that question before asking me about emotional instability. The room was quiet for a moment. Alistair Vane spoke for the first time. His voice was even and reasonable, the voice of a man who had long ago learned that tone was its own kind of argument. Nobody authorized anything, Seraphina. The document was brought to the board's attention by a third party concerned about the company's direction. We're not making accusations, we're doing due diligence. Then do it, she said. I welcome it. I'd suggest starting with whoever compiled those photographs. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her for 9 years, with the patient, almost affectionate condescension of a man who has decided that a woman's competence is a temporary condition. You seem agitated, he said. I seem precise, she said. There's a difference. You've been making that error for 9 years. The meeting ended 40 minutes later without resolution, which was fine. Seraphina hadn't expected resolution. She had expected to see clearly who was sitting where and what they were willing to say, with their names attached. And she had gotten that. Patricia Osei had kept her face neutral throughout, but she'd made eye contact with Seraphina when they stood to leave a brief, deliberate look that communicated something without words. Gerald Fitch had not made eye contact at all. 2 other board members she'd considered uncertain had both asked follow-up questions about the foundation's structure that were genuinely procedural rather than hostile. That was useful to know. Alistair had left without speaking to her again. That was the most useful thing of all. Diane had the full document package ready by 3 in the afternoon. Seraphina reviewed it at her desk, cross-checking the foundation filings against the claims in the anonymous document, and found what she had suspected, that the characterization of the finances relied on a deliberately partial reading of the accounts, cherry-picked quarters, omitted context, kind of numbers that told a story when arranged carefully and told a different story when you added the pages that had been left out. Someone had access to company account records. Partial access selectively used, but access nonetheless. That narrowed things considerably. She called her head of internal security, a former federal investigator named Wallace Trent, and gave him a specific list of questions to answer by end of week. She did not tell him about the Garner Street surveillance. She kept that separate. She was, at this point, operating on two parallel tracks: the official one, with proper documentation and legal frameworks, and the other one, which was less official and more useful, and which involved a man with a plate number and a network of contacts she hadn't asked about yet. Called Beckett that evening. It was the first time she'd called him directly, rather than through the center's main line or Sandra. He picked up after 2 rings. "Seraphina," he said. "How did you know it was me?" "I put the number in after you gave it to Sandra." A pause. In case. She hadn't asked him to. Sandra had provided it as a donor contact. He'd added it without explanation, as a precaution, the way you secured a perimeter before you knew whether you'd need it. She thought about that for a moment and then moved on. "The board meeting was today," she said. "How did it go?" She told him the document, Gerald Fitch, Alistair's performance of neutrality, the photography question that had sat in the room like something no one wanted to pick up. Beckett listened without interrupting. She noticed again the quality of his listening, not the performed attention of someone waiting for their turn, but the actual thing which had a different texture. "He's doing 2 things at once," Beckett said when she finished. "The document is about the company that's the long play. But the surveillance of Piper is different. That's personal. That's designed to make you feel watched and vulnerable so that you make a decision from fear rather than from sense. I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway, because knowing it and feeling it are different things, and he's counting on the feeling." He paused. "My friend who ran the plate, he did some more digging. Meridian Private Services has done work for Vane Capital before, 3 years ago. A commercial dispute that went quiet suddenly. Seraphina was still. That connects them. It connects a contractor to a company. It doesn't prove Alistair directed this specific operation. But it's something. Can your friend document it? He's working on it. He's not official, Seraphina. He's a guy I served with who's good at finding things. He won't testify. But what he finds you can hand to someone who can." She thought about Wallace Trent, about her lawyers, about the distance between what could be known and what could be proven, and the territory that existed in between. "Tell him to keep going," she said. "Already did," Beckett said. December gave way to January without any of the grace that calendar transitions pretended to offer. The Westbridge winter settled in properly gray days, with a cold that had weight to it, the kind that got into old buildings and required constant attention. Beckett spent the first 2 weeks of January fighting the center's heating system, with the focused intensity of a man who had decided the heating system would not win, and the heating system gave ground slowly and without dignity. The children were inside more. Piper had taught Jamie to play a card game whose rules she appeared to have partially invented, and Jamie played it with suspicious competence, which Piper either didn't notice or chose to overlook. They had, without announcement, settled into the kind of friendship that 8- and 10-year-olds form when they share adjacent spaces regularly asymmetrical in age, compatible in temperament, founded on argument, and the willingness to reappear after the argument ended. For Seraphina, watching it was complicated. She was glad. She was also aware that gladness of this specific variety came with weight attached, that the more Piper loved this, the more it cost if it stopped. She was familiar with the arithmetic of attachment. She had done the math before. She mentioned this to Beckett obliquely. On a Thursday when she'd come by the center to drop off equipment for the vocational program, and he'd found her standing in the doorway of the main room, watching Piper explain her invented card game to an elderly veteran named Frank, who was nodding. With the polite incomprehension of a man who had decided engagement was more important than understanding. "She's good with him," Beckett said, coming to stand beside her. "She is," Seraphina said. Then, without quite planning it, "Do you ever worry about stopping?" He looked at her. "This," she said, imprecisely. "All of it. What happens if it stops?" He was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he said. "When Jamie first started coming here, I watched every exit. Old habit. Looking for what could go wrong. Does that get better?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You start to notice it less. But you don't stop. You just learn to walk into the room anyway. She looked at Piper, who had apparently gotten Frank to agree to try a hand and was now dealing cards with the solemn authority of a child who has decided an adult needs her help. She stopped laughing like that after Daniel died. Seraphina said, "Not immediately, it took a few months. And then one day I noticed she'd gotten quieter, and I couldn't remember when it had happened." Beckett said nothing. He didn't offer a response, which was the correct thing to do with an observation that didn't require one. "I'd forgotten what it sounded like," she said. "The real version. I got used to the careful version." "She's not careful here," he said. "No," Seraphina agreed, "she's not." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the room moving around them, Frank's uncertain questions about the card game, Harold arguing with someone in the next room about something neither of them could verify, the distant clang of the heating system registering its ongoing grievances. "The foundation paperwork cleared legal this week," she said, shifting. "It's official, I heard. Sandra's been telling everyone. There's a grant structure for facilities maintenance at veteran-serving nonprofits. This center qualifies." He turned to look at her. Not suspiciously, just directly. "Is this the part where I'm supposed to say thank you?" "You're supposed to apply for the grant through the proper channels," she said. "Sandra has the information. It goes through an independent review board. So it has nothing to do with you." "It has something to do with me," she said honestly. "I designed the criteria. But it applies to 12 centers in this district, and it'll be reviewed by people who don't know I'm standing here talking to you about it." He looked at her for another moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay? You designed something fair," he said. "That's not a small thing." He paused. "A lot of people design things that look fair." She understood the distinction. It sat between them for a moment, and then she went back to watching Piper lose 2 of her own invented cards to a 70-year-old veteran who had, apparently, understood the game better than he'd let on. The anniversary gala for Crowell Logistics fell on the last Friday of January. It was not Seraphina's preferred kind of evening. It was the kind of event the company's PR department designed with the precision of a military operation: the venue, the guest list, the speeches timed to the minute, the photography arranged so that nothing looked arranged. She attended because she was the company, and the company was marking its 15th year, and some things were simply required. She did not think about Beckett or the center or any of it during the day leading up to the gala. She was in 3 meetings, reviewed the final program twice, made 2 adjustments to the speech her communications director had drafted, and changed from her work clothes into a midnight blue dress in her office bathroom at 6:15 while Diane stood outside the door relaying messages about seating arrangements. Piper was not at the gala. Piper was at home with Mrs. Hark, which was standard for school night events. Marcus had confirmed the arrangement twice. The house security system was active. Everything was in order. Seraphina noted all of this, the way she noted everything that was supposed to be in order, thoroughly, without assuming that order was the same as safety. The gala was held at the Westbridge Grand Hotel on Callaway Avenue, a venue the company had used for 6 consecutive years, which meant the logistics of the evening were familiar to every member of the events team. 800 guests, 3 floors of function rooms, a dinner on the 2nd floor, followed by an awards presentation on the 3rd. The catering staff had a separate entrance on the building's west side. The freight elevator ran from the basement loading dock to the 4th floor. The service corridors connected the kitchen to the main function rooms, and also, if you knew the building well, to the maintenance areas in the back wing. This last detail was the kind of thing that would not occur to a guest, or to a PR director, or to most members of a security team managing an 800-person event. It occurred to Beckett. Seraphina had not told him about the gala. He had not been invited. It was a company event, not a personal one, and the nature of their relationship was navigating the territory between the two. 2 days before the event, he had sent her a text message that said simply, "What's the venue layout like?" She had sent him the floor plan. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd done it so quickly, without stopping to ask why he wanted it. She had done it the way you handed someone a tool. When they asked for it, the question of what they were building could come after. He had not replied. She had assumed he'd looked at it and found nothing to concern him. She was wrong. The dinner service had been running for 40 minutes when Seraphina's phone buzzed twice in her clutch, not a call, a text. She was at the host table, mid-conversation with the company's longest-tenured client, a freight conglomerate out of Tanner City, whose founder was 81 and still came to these things because, as he put it, he liked the chicken. She excused herself with a smile and looked at her phone under the table. The text was from Mrs. Park. Piper asked to use the upstairs bathroom. That was 12 minutes ago. She hasn't come back down. I knocked and she didn't answer. I've opened the door, she's not in there. I'm looking through the house now. Seraphina was standing before she'd consciously decided to stand. She looked at the table, at the 800-person room, at the venue's security team stationed at the four corners. She could see. She was calculating. Marcus was here, with the car, because she'd needed him for arrival. The house had 2 security personnel on the grounds tonight in addition to Mrs. Park. Piper knew not to go outside. Her phone buzzed again. Mrs. Park. I've checked all rooms. She's not in the house. Both security guards are searching the garden. Cold. Very specific cold. Starting at the sternum, she called Beckett. She didn't stop to think about calling him instead of Marcus, instead of the company's head of security, instead of anyone on the list of people whose job it was to handle situations like this. Called him because her hands already knew to. He picked up on the first ring. Piper, she said. She's not in the house. Mrs. Park can't find her. She went to the upstairs bathroom and... How long, he said. His voice was completely level. 12 minutes from when Mrs. Park texted, maybe 15 total, the house address. You don't have it, Seraphina. Address. She gave it to him. Stay at the gala, he said. Don't leave the venue yet. If this is what I think it is, leaving suddenly and alone puts you in a worse position. Keep your phone on. I'll call you in 10 minutes. Beckett, 10 minutes, he said. I'm already moving. He disconnected. She stood at the edge of the function room with her phone in both hands, sounds of the gala continuing around her silverware and conversation, and the distant, warm hum of 800 people who didn't know that anything had changed, and she breathed in through her nose and made herself think rather than feel, because thinking was the only useful thing she could do from here. She found her head of company security, a man named Reyes, and spoke to him quietly for 90 seconds. He had his radio out before she finished. She told him not to make a scene. He nodded and moved toward the exit with the practiced efficiency of someone who was very good at not making scenes. Then she waited. 8 minutes later, her phone rang. She's here, Beckett said. The breath she released was not something she would have chosen to make audible. Came out anyway. She's okay, he said. She's with me. She's fine. Where the Veterans Center. His voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, a quality of control maintained by effort rather than absence of feeling. She walked here, on her own. It's 1.5 miles. Seraphina, she walked it alone at night. How did she even know? She told me she knew the route because she'd counted the turns. She was looking for Jamie. He paused. She told Mrs. Park she was going to the bathroom, and she went out through the garden gate. Security guys were at the front. Seraphina pressed her hand flat to her sternum. Cold there was still present, but had changed in quality, still fear, but retrospective now, the kind that arrived after the worst didn't happen, and sat in your chest, reminding you how close the math had been. Set, Seraphina asked. No, she's eating crackers. She's a pause, and she could hear in the half-second gap that he was looking at her daughter. She's embarrassed now that I've called you. She thought she'd be back before anyone noticed. She walked 1.5 miles alone at night. I know. She's 8? I know. He said it with the emphasis of someone who had already cycled through their own version of this feeling. Told me she was careful. She stayed on the lit streets. That's... Seraphina stopped. That's both very Piper and absolutely unacceptable. Yes, he said both things. I'm leaving the gala. I'm coming there, I figured, he said. But it was not until she was in the car, Marcus driving faster than the posted limit, that she received the second call, not from Beckett this time, but from Reyes. Mrs. Crowell, he said. We pulled the gala's security footage from the service corridor on the second floor. About 40 minutes into the dinner service, 2 men in catering uniforms entered the corridor from the freight elevator. They didn't have credentials matching the caterer's list. A pause. They were carrying a radio. They were positioned near the access point to the function room's private corridor. That's the corridor that leads to the private dining rooms, including the family holding room. Seraphina understood immediately. The family holding room was where Piper would have been, if Seraphina had brought her tonight. It was where board members' families waited during long events. It was off the main floor, quieter, less visible, the place someone would put a child they wanted briefly separated. They weren't there for me, she said. No, Reyes said. They were in position for approximately 25 minutes before they left via the same elevator. When they realized the holding room was empty, someone told them Piper might be at the gala, or assumed she would be based on previous events. She attended the Q3 dinner. Seraphina looked out the car window at the winter city moving past. Pieces arranged themselves with the bleak efficiency of things that had been true for a while, and only now had enough of themselves assembled to be visible. The anonymous document, the Garner Street surveillance, 2 men in the service corridor, Piper's actual location at the community center, safe eating crackers a mile and a half from where they'd been waiting. Her daughter had, entirely by accident and for entirely the wrong reasons, walked out of a plan that had been built around her. Irony of it would not land for several hours. Right now, there was only the movement of the car and the winter dark, and the particular quality of silence that came after fear had done its math and found a remainder of anger. She arrived at the center at 9:47. Piper was in the main hall with Beckett, sitting on the folding table, the way she sat on surfaces when she was thinking, knees together, feet swinging slightly, hands in her lap. She had a sleeve of crackers beside her, and the careful expression of a child who has realized the magnitude of what she's done and is composing her position on it. Seraphina walked through the door and stopped. She looked at her daughter for a moment. Piper looked back. Then Seraphina crossed the room and folded Piper into an embrace that had nothing composed about it, both arms, tight, the way the one at the gala had been but longer, and without the rapid inventory of checking, because she already knew Piper was intact, and the knowing made the holding easier and harder simultaneously. Piper held on. "I'm sorry," Piper said into her shoulder. Her voice was small and had lost all of its defensive preparation. "I thought Jamie might be here." "The center was closed," Seraphina said. "It's night." "I know. I thought maybe Beckett might be doing night stuff." Seraphina pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. "Night stuff," she repeated. "He's here sometimes late. I've seen the lights from the car. That doesn't mean you walk here alone at night. I was careful, Piper." Seraphina said it quietly, which was the register Piper knew was real. "I know you were careful. I know you stayed on the lit streets and counted the turns and thought it through. I know you, and I know how you think, and I know you were careful. And I need you to understand that careful is not the same as safe. Not at 8, not at night, not alone." She paused. "I need you to understand that." Piper was quiet. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, which was its own kind of Piper holding it until she'd decided whether it needed to come out. "I understand," she said finally. "We'll talk more at home." Piper nodded. Seraphina stood up and turned to Beckett, who had stepped back to give them room and was standing near the wall with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching them with the expression of someone who was present without inserting himself into something that wasn't his. "Thank you," she said. "She called me," he said, when she got close and realized the building was dark. "She remembered my number." Seraphina looked at Piper. "You gave it to me," Piper said. "In your phone. I looked at it one time and I remembered." Seraphina processed this. Her daughter had memorized a phone number from a single glance and deployed it with calm pragmatism in the dark outside a locked building at night. She was equal parts infuriated and struck uncomfortably by how much it reminded her of herself at 8. "Smart," she said. "And we're still talking at home." "I know," Piper said. Beckett walked them to the car. The night was very cold, the street quiet except for a distant bus and Harold's armchair, which was dark tonight because Harold went home at 8 regardless of events. Seraphina had started to open the car door when Beckett said quietly, "There's something else." She looked at him. "When I got to the center and unlocked it, I checked the perimeter before I brought her in." Force of habit. He paused. There was a car parked down the block. Dark sedan. Different plate than the Garner Street car, but same contractor type, no markings. Dark windows. One occupant. Seraphina was very still. "He drove off when he saw me," Beckett said. "But he'd been there. He'd seen her walk up and go to the door. Cold she felt now was not the winter. They were following her," she said. "Or the center." He looked at her steadily. "Either way, someone knew she was here before I did." She thought about the gala, the service corridor, the family holding room empty. She thought about the 2 men with radios leaving via the freight elevator when they found no child waiting where they'd expected one to be. Alistair knew she was at the center, she said. It wasn't a question. He might have had a second team deployed, and the first one found the holding room empty. Beckett's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, not anger exactly. quality of a man who has gathered all the relevant information and arrived at a conclusion that requires controlled response rather than immediate action. He's not trying to hurt her, Seraphina. This is still pressure. He wanted to demonstrate that he could reach her, that she wasn't protected, that your security has gaps, that you should be afraid. He demonstrated that, she said. Yes, Beckett said. He did. He paused, which means he thinks he's still in control of the timeline. She looked at him. And is he? He met her eyes. Not anymore, he said. She got in the car. Piper was already in the back seat, seatbelt on, crackers in her lap, looking out the window with the contained expression of a child carrying more understanding of the evening than an 8-year-old should have to carry. Marcus put the car in drive. Seraphina looked back at the building as they pulled away the dark windows, the painted mural just visible through the glass of the main hall, and Beckett standing on the sidewalk watching them go. He didn't wave. He just stood there until they turned the corner, which was more than most people did and different from what any of them did, and she recognized, with the particular clarity that comes at the end of a long and frightening night, that the difference mattered. The next 48 hours moved fast. Wallace Trent, working from the documentation Seraphina had provided, and a set of account records he'd subpoenaed through a regulatory filing rather than a direct legal action, slower, less visible, harder to preempt, identified the mechanism of Alistair's account manipulation by noon on Sunday. It was not complicated in its logic, only in its execution, a series of internal transfers routed through a subsidiary account that had been classified as a hedging vehicle in 2019. The transactions themselves were small and individually defensible. In aggregate, over 31 months, they formed a pattern that no legitimate hedging strategy would produce. Trent brought the documentation to Seraphina's legal counsel Sunday afternoon. They were joined by a forensic accountant who spent 3 hours reviewing the records and said, at the end of it, that she had seen cleaner fraud in federal cases. Beckett's contact provided supplementary evidence, payment records from a shell company that had contracted Meridian Private Services twice, once in 2021 and once in the current year. The shell company traced to a private equity vehicle. Private equity vehicle traced to Vane Capital through 2 intermediary LLCs. It was not ironclad. It was, the lawyers said, more than enough to trigger a formal investigation and sufficient for an emergency board petition. Patricia Ossie, when Seraphina called her Sunday evening, was quiet for a long moment after hearing the outline. How long have you had the financial documentation? She asked. Long enough, Seraphina said. I wanted it complete before I moved. And the surveillance material? Corroborated independently. Another silence. All right, Patricia said. I'll call Gerald Fitch. He'll fold, he always does when the numbers are clear. A pause. I'm sorry I didn't move sooner on the document, Seraphina. You brought it to me, Seraphina said. That was the right call. It should have been my first call, not my second. Seraphina didn't argue with that. Some apologies were accurate enough that adding grace notes made them less honest. The emergency board session was convened on Monday morning. Alistair arrived assuming it was procedural. He was told it was procedural. He understood it wasn't procedural approximately 5 minutes into the presentation by Seraphina's legal counsel, at which point his face underwent a very controlled rearrangement that Seraphina watched with the focus of someone reading a document they intend to keep. Financial records were presented. The Meridian Services connection was presented. The gala security footage was presented 2 men in catering uniforms, time-stamped, positioned outside the family holding room. Reyes had pulled additional footage showing the same vehicle from Garner Street in proximity to 3 separate locations connected to Piper's routine schedule over the previous 6 weeks. Alistair's counsel objected to the admissibility of the surveillance connection on evidentiary grounds. Seraphina's counsel noted that the session was a board proceeding rather than a legal trial, and that the evidence standard was fiduciary responsibility and board governance, not criminal prosecution. Gerald Fitch, as predicted, had come in prepared to abstain and left prepared to vote for Alistair's removal. The vote was 6-2, 1 abstention. Alistair said, when it was done, looking at Seraphina across the table with the expression of a man who had decided that the loss was a temporary condition, "You understand this isn't finished." "Yes," she said. "The regulatory investigation is just starting." He had not meant that, but she had answered it anyway, which closed the door on whatever he had meant. He left. His counsel left. The room rearranged itself into something that breathed differently. Patricia Osei sat down beside Seraphina when the others had gone. "How are you?" she asked. Not formally. The real question. Seraphina thought about Piper sitting on the folding table eating crackers. She thought about the dark sedan pulling away from the curb. She thought about Beckett on the sidewalk watching them turn the corner. "Tired," she said. It was the most accurate single word. "That's the right answer," Patricia said. Anyone who said they were fine after 2 months of that would be lying. Seraphina almost smiled. "Patricia." "What?" "Thank you. For the call. The original one." Patricia looked at her steadily. "You're going to be all right, Seraphina. I've watched you run this company for 3 years, and I've watched you do it, while carrying things you shouldn't have had to carry alone. You're going to be very all right." Seraphina looked at the empty end of the conference table, where Alistair had sat. She thought about what all right had looked like 2 months ago. The large, quiet house, the 8 chairs, the careful version of Piper's laugh. "I'm working on a different version of all right," she said. Patricia Osei, who was 60 and had been working on her own version for some years, understood exactly what that meant and said nothing further, which was the right response to a thing that didn't need improvement. She drove to the center that afternoon. She hadn't called ahead. It was a Monday, not a program day. She wasn't sure who would be there. But the light was on in the maintenance room, which she could see from the parking area, and Beckett's truck was in the lot. She went in through the front. Sandra wasn't there. The front desk was unmanned, the building quiet in the way of a place that did its primary work on weekends and spent weekdays catching up with itself. She walked down the corridor to the maintenance room. The door was open. Beckett was at the workbench, doing something with a length of electrical cable that required concentration, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps. She stood in the doorway. "It's done," she said. "The board voted this morning. He's removed." He set the cable down. He looked at her the same direct, unhurried look he'd been giving her since the first time she'd stood in this building in a wool coat and heels trying to thank him for not losing her daughter. "Good," he said. "The regulatory investigation will take time. There may be more." "There usually is," he said. She leaned against the doorframe. The room smelled like it always did, tools and sawdust, and that particular underlayer of old building that was not unpleasant, that had become over the past months associated in her mind with something she didn't have a simple name for. "Piper asked about Jamie this morning," she said. "Jamie asked about Piper yesterday. She wants to come Saturday. He'll be here." A pause. "So will I." She looked at the workbench, at the ordered tools and the cable and the work order clipboard with its running list of things that needed fixing. Things that had been on the list for months and stayed on the list until someone with the right knowledge and the right time got to them. "Beckett," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him. There were things she could have said, careful things, appropriate things, the kinds of things you said when you understood the weight of a moment and wanted to handle it correctly. She had spent 4 years handling things correctly. "I don't know what this is," she said. I don't know what to call it." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to call it anything yet," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of it, that I'm not pretending it isn't there." He looked at her steadily. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm not either." Outside, the winter afternoon was going to gray, and the heating system was registering a new opinion in the walls somewhere. And down the corridor, Harold's armchair was empty, because Harold went home at 8. The building held itself around them, imperfect and ongoing, and full of things that needed attention, and people who kept showing up to give it. Seraphina stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she straightened. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the front door and the cold outside, and the drive home to the house where her daughter was waiting, with something to say about the crackers and the dark and the mile and a half she'd walked alone. And about all of it, the whole complicated, unfinished thing that they were all still in the middle of. The conversation at home that evening was hard and honest and ran longer than Seraphina had planned, and Piper cried partway through it, and Seraphina held her, and then they talked some more, and it ended not with resolution exactly, but with something real between them, which was, Seraphina had learned, almost always better than resolution. She sat at the dining table afterward alone in the quiet house. All 8 chairs were around it, the same as always. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she went to make tea and left the lights on. The regulatory investigation into Alistair Vane's conduct at Crowell Logistics was formally opened by the Westbridge Financial Oversight Commission on the 3rd Tuesday of February, 14 days after the board vote and 6 weeks after the anonymous document had first appeared in Patricia Ossi's inbox. Seraphina received the confirmation from her legal team on a Wednesday morning, read it twice, forwarded it to Diane with a single instruction file, this with the Q4 board correspondence, and went back to the meeting she'd been in. She didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. The investigation would take months, and Alistair had lawyers who were very good at making months into years, and the outcome was probable rather than certain, and Seraphina had been in the business of probable outcomes long enough to know that probable was not the same as done. What the confirmation meant, practically, was that the machinery was now larger than both of them, that what happened next would be decided by processes that didn't require her constant attention, which freed her to pay attention to other things. She paid attention to her company, which had a Rotterdam hub that had been running at reduced capacity for 6 weeks and needed restructuring. She paid attention to the foundation, which had received its first round of applications from veteran-serving nonprofits in the Westbridge district and required her to sit on a review panel for 3 days in mid-February. She paid attention to Piper, who had responded to the events of January with a complicated mix of guilt about the walk to the center, anger about not being told more of what was happening, and the particular resilience of children who have already survived one large loss and know, at a cellular level, that survival is possible. They had 2 more hard conversations in February. Both of them ran long. Both of them ended in a place that was closer to honest than comfortable, which Seraphina was increasingly convinced was the correct direction of travel. What she did not pay attention to or tried not to, with the variable success of someone suppressing. Something that had decided it didn't want to be suppressed was the slow, inconvenient, entirely real thing that had been growing between her and Beckett Rhodes since October. It grew anyway. That was the nature of it. Grew in the particular texture of their Saturday mornings at the center, which had developed their own rhythms over 4 months, the way he brought 2 coffees out to the courtyard when she arrived, not asking if she wanted one, because she always wanted one. The way she had stopped coming in her good coat and started coming in the practical one because the courtyard was cold and she'd accepted this. The way their conversations had extended past the center's operational matters, the grant applications, the roof repair that had finally been completed in January into other territory, her father's shipping business, which had been the template for everything she'd built. His years of service, described in the careful, edited way of someone who had learned which parts of that time were shareable and which parts needed to stay where they were. Particular shape of his son's personality, which Beckett discussed with the frank, wondering bewilderment of a single parent who had done his best and produced something unexpected and good. Told me last week he wants to be a veterinarian. Beckett said one Saturday morning in late February. He said it the way you'd say something had surprised you and you hadn't caught up to it yet. That's very different from baseball, Seraphina said. 3 months ago, it was a pitcher. Month before that, it was a structural engineer because Sandra told him about the roof repair, and he spent 2 weekends asking questions about load-bearing walls. He looked at his coffee. Can't tell if he's unfocused or just interested in everything. Interested in everything, Seraphina said. How do you know? Because he's interested in the thing in front of him, not bouncing between things to avoid settling. There's a difference. She paused. Piper was the same at his age. It worried me for a while. And now? And now she's 8, and she's taught 3 veterans to play a card game she invented, and she can explain the rules of baseball to Harold without condescension. She'll figure out what she wants to do with it. Beckett looked at her. You're better at this than you think you are, he said. At what? At reading them. At knowing what they need. She looked back at the courtyard, where Piper and Jamie were attempting to teach Frank's grandson, who was visiting for the weekend, the rules of the invented card game, and Jamie was already mediating an interpretive dispute with the seriousness of a 10-year-old judge. I make mistakes, she said. Everyone does. I made a specific one for 2 years, she said, after Daniel. I got so focused on making everything stable and secure that I made it quiet instead. That's different. She hadn't said this out loud before in quite this configuration. It was strange how saying something out loud made it more final, not heavier, but cleaner somehow, less available for revision. Piper needed noise. She needed the ordinary messy stuff. I gave her a beautiful, quiet house and called it stability. Beckett was quiet for a moment. You were grieving, he said. I know. I'm not, she paused. I'm not flogging myself over it. I'm just naming it. Because it changed when we started coming here, and I want to know what changed, so I don't unchange it. He looked at her with that expression she'd catalogued months ago, the one that was harder to read than most, that sat at the intersection of several things simultaneously. The noise changed, he said. She's got someone to argue with. She's got Jamie. And you've got. He stopped. The sentence sat between them, unfinished, which was its own kind of finished. Seraphina looked at her coffee cup. Beckett, she said. I know, he said. I'm not ready to, she stopped. Started again. I'm aware that I'm not afraid of it. Probably tell you that. Okay, he said. I'm aware that it exists. I'm just not sure I know how to do it. Again, when there's this much to break. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You think I know how, he said. I've been trying to figure out how to be in the same courtyard as you. Without I'm working on it too, Seraphina. It's not like I have a method. Something about the absence of a method, the admission of it, direct and uncalculated, made the conversation feel less dangerous than it had 2 seconds earlier. She was so accustomed to people who had methods, who arrived with strategies and frameworks and approaches, who treated the difficult things in life as problems with solutions rather than weights you learned to carry differently over time. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They finished their coffee. Frank's grandson lost the card game badly, and Jamie adjudicated the result with solemnity, and Piper accepted her victory with slightly more grace than she felt, which was growth. March arrived and the investigation into Alistair gathered material. His lawyers filed 2 procedural objections, both of which were resolved without altering the timeline. Gerald Fitch, who had been distancing himself from Alistair since the board vote, with the energy of a man trying to win an argument about where he'd been standing, provided a voluntary statement to the Oversight Commission that corroborated the account structure findings without adding anything new. Alistair's son Elliot released a statement through a PR firm saying the family was cooperating fully with all relevant inquiries, which was the kind of statement that meant the opposite of what it said. Patricia Osei had been elected interim board chair at the February session, pending a formal election in April. She ran the interim period with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting for a room to catch up to what she already knew. The board's atmosphere changed in ways that were hard to quantify but immediately apparent to anyone who worked in it. Less performed deference, more actual argument, which was better because actual argument produced decisions and performed deference produced minutes that didn't match what had happened in the room. Seraphina found herself in late March, sleeping better than she had in months. She noticed this the way she noticed the other small reversals, Piper's laugh, the 8-chair table that had started to feel less accusatory, the fact that she'd cooked dinner 4 times in March and only burned 1 of them. Small evidence of something having shifted. She didn't name it too precisely. Naming things precisely was useful in business and destructive in everything else. It was the last Saturday in March when everything that had been quietly building arrived at the moment it had been moving toward. They were at the center. It was a program day full house, including a new cohort of veterans enrolled in the vocational program and a Saturday lunch that Sandra had organized with donations from 3 local restaurants. The main hall was louder than usual, which made it feel warmer than the temperature warranted. Harold had brought a friend who had also served, a man named Dex, who was 80, and had decided within 15 minutes of arriving that the center was acceptable, and Harold was lucky to have found it, which Harold accepted as the compliment it technically was. Piper and Jamie were in the back courtyard with 4 other children from the program families, engaged in something that had started as a relay race and evolved into a negotiated hybrid of rules that neither adult supervising them entirely understood. Seraphina had looked out the window at them 3 times and decided each time that they were fine. She was helping Sandra organize the lunch service carrying trays, which was not a thing she typically did at the center, but which felt right that afternoon in the way that physical useful work sometimes felt right when you had been doing invisible useful work for weeks when Diane called. It was the 3rd call in 20 minutes. Seraphina had let the first 2 go to voicemail. On the 3rd, something about the frequency made her step out to the side corridor. Tell me, she said. Alistair's lawyers filed an emergency injunction this morning, Diane said. They're challenging the board vote on procedural grounds, claiming the emergency session notification was insufficient. Seraphina leaned against the corridor wall. On what basis? They're citing a bylaw about notice periods for emergency sessions. The notice was sent 42 hours in advance. The bylaw specifies 48, 6 hours. A 6-hour technical gap in a notice period was the mechanism. Who found that? She said. They had someone go through the governance documents. Someone thorough. A pause, Seraphina, it's not going to succeed. Our lawyers are confident, but it creates a delay. They're asking for a temporary restoration of Alistair's board seat, pending the procedural review. Temporary meaning 4 to 6 weeks. She absorbed this. 4 to 6 weeks of restored access to board communications, to the governance structure, to the people who had voted to remove him, who would now have to sit across from him again. It was not a reversal. It was a pressure tactic. Make the process uncomfortable enough and expensive enough that people second-guess their positions. What do the lawyers need from me? She asked. Diane told her. It was manageable documentation she already had, statements from board members who had been present, a governance review. Nothing that changed the underlying facts. Just work. All right, she said. Have them send the files. I'll look tonight. She disconnected and stood in the corridor for a moment. The sounds of the lunch service came through the door voices. The particular percussive layer of a room with too many folding chairs. Sandra laughing at something Harold had said. She pushed off the wall and went back in. She told Beckett at the end of the afternoon, when the lunch had been cleared and the families were filtering out, and the main hall was returning to itself. He was stacking chairs at the far end of the room. She came and stacked the ones beside him and told him while they worked, because telling him while doing something else made it easier to be precise about it, without the weight of direct eye contact adding to the words. He listened. He stacked chairs. 4 to 6 weeks, he said, when she'd finished. Maximum, our lawyers are confident. But in the meantime, he has access. To the board, not to operations, not to accounts. She lifted another chair. It's a harassment strategy. Make the process costly enough that I start to question whether the fight is worth it. Is it? She looked at him. Not asking because I think you should quit, he said. Asking because it's a real question, and you should know the answer. She thought about the overlay of the last 6 months. The anonymous document. Garner Street. The gala. Piper in the dark outside a locked building. The hard conversations that had run longer than planned and ended better than they'd started. Yes, she said. Okay, he said. They finished the chairs. He went to lock the supply closet, and she went to find her coat. And for a while, the center was just people moving through the routines of ending a daylights being checked, doors being locked, Harold being gently redirected toward the exit by Sandra, who had developed a tone specifically for this purpose. She was pulling on her coat when he came back. The kids are in the courtyard, he said. I know, I'm getting them. He stopped. He looked at her. Something in his expression was different, not unfamiliar, but moved forward from where it usually lived, closer to the surface. Seraphina, he said. She looked at him. When this is over, he said. The injunction, the investigation, all of it, I'd like to take you to dinner. Not here, not with the kids. Just, he paused, and she could see him choosing the words rather than finding them automatically somewhere where nobody needs anything from either of us for a couple of hours. She was quiet for a moment. The investigation could take until June, she said. I know. That's a long time to hold a dinner reservation. Something shifted in his expression. I've waited longer for things that mattered less, he said. She looked at him for a long moment at the work shirt and the gray at his temples and the hands that had repaired half the things in this building and the particular quality of steadiness that he carried, not because nothing had ever cost him. Anything but because he'd paid the cost and kept moving. All right, she said. His mouth did the thing it did not quite a smile yet, but the near version, the one she'd been cataloging. All right, he said. She went to get Piper and Jamie from the courtyard. Piper was arguing about the relay race's final results, which had apparently remained contested. Jamie was maintaining his position with the composure of a judge who has heard the appeal and is not changing the ruling. The other children had gone home already, leaving the dispute as a two-person matter. Time to go, Seraphina said. But we haven't resolved it, Piper said. The relay race? Seraphina said. How long has it been unresolved? Since 2:30. Then it'll survive being unresolved a little longer. Piper looked at Jamie. Jamie looked at Piper with the expression of someone who is willing to table the discussion, but is not conceding the point. Next Saturday, Piper said. Next Saturday, he agreed, as if it were a legal agreement. April moved. The injunction was challenged. Seraphina's legal team was, as predicted, correct about the timeline. The procedural review was completed in 4 weeks, rather than 6, and the determination was that the emergency session notice, while technically short of the 48-hour requirement, had been delivered to all board members with sufficient time for and that the procedural deficiency did not constitute grounds for reversing the vote. Alistair's temporary restoration lasted 19 days. He attended 2 board meetings during that period, both chaired by Patricia Osei, both conducted with the kind of precision that left no procedural gaps to exploit and said very little. He looked, Seraphina thought, like a man who had been expecting a different building and arrived to find the furniture rearranged. The investigation continued. His lawyers filed one more procedural objection. It was denied in 12 days. The company, meanwhile, had its best Q1 in 3 years. The Rotterdam hub came back to full capacity in late March. 2 new contracts were finalized in April, including one with a pharmaceutical logistics firm that had been in negotiation for 7 months. Seraphina presented the Q1 results to the board in April, and did it in 22 minutes, which was 8 minutes shorter than any previous quarterly presentation, because the numbers made their own argument and didn't need help. Patricia Osei afterwards said, "I've been on 11 company boards. That was the cleanest quarterly I've seen." The numbers were clean, Seraphina said. The numbers are always clean somewhere. Most people dress them up anyway. Patricia looked at her for a moment. "You look better." "I'm sleeping," Seraphina said. "Good. Keep doing that." The dinner happened in mid-May. Seraphina had half expected some logistical complication to preempt it, the investigation producing something that required immediate attention, or a company issue, or the ordinary accumulative weight of 2 people with children and full lives trying to place one event in calendar. Instead, it materialized with a straightforwardness that felt almost suspicious after months of complicated maneuvering. She wore the dark blue dress she hadn't worn since the gala, not because she'd thought about it, but because she pulled it out and it was the right thing, and then she thought about it briefly and decided that was all right. The restaurant was small and not obviously expensive, which she suspected had been the point of choosing it. The reservation was in his name, which she only noticed because the host said Mr. Rhodes when they arrived. She looked at him. "You made the reservation," she said. "That's how reservations work," he said. It was the right restaurant. Not quiet enough to feel staged, not loud enough to require competing with the room. They had a table near the window, which looked out onto a narrow street that Westbridge had converted into a walking path sometime in the last decade, and the May evening light came through at an angle that made everything look slightly better than it was, which was the particular quality of May evenings in cities. The conversation was different from their Saturday mornings in the courtyard. Not better or worse different in kind, the way the same person sounds different in a different room. They talked about things they hadn't made time for, in the context of the center, his childhood in a small city 3 states north, the particular quality of the work that had drawn him to the SEAL program, not the action of it, but the precision, the idea that something could be planned down to its margins, and that the planning itself was a form of respect for the difficulty. She told him about her first year running the company after Daniel, about the board member who had told her, with apparent sincerity, that she should consider hiring a male deputy to provide continuity in leadership optics, and how she had thanked him and then spent 6 months ensuring he had no further influence over any hiring decisions. Beckett looked at her when she said this. What happened to him? He retired in 2023. He sent me a card. She paused. Kept it. Why? Because it reminded me that people are capable of changing their position when the evidence gets heavy enough. Even people who were wrong for a long time. She turned her wine glass. I find that useful to remember. He was quiet for a moment. You apply that to everyone? I try to, including Alistair? She thought about it honestly. I apply it to what's possible, she said. I don't know if Alistair will change his position. But I know he's capable of understanding evidence. He just needs the evidence to be conclusive enough. She paused. The Oversight Commission will make it conclusive enough. Beckett nodded. What about you? She asked. Does it apply? He looked at her. People changing? You. Whether you apply that to yourself. He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged the question. Then he said, I spent 2 years after Laura died thinking the mistake was getting too close to things. That if I'd held a little more back, it would have hurt less. He set down his fork. That wasn't the mistake. The mistake was thinking distance was a form of protection. She looked at him. It wasn't, he said. It was just loneliness with better posture. She almost laughed. It came out partly as a laugh and partly as something else. She stopped. What? That's the most accurate description of the last 4 years I've heard, she said. And I've heard a lot of descriptions. He did smile then. The actual one. The full article brief, controlled, but real. It changed his whole face in a way she'd been watching for since October and still wasn't prepared for. People gave you a lot of descriptions, he said. Everyone has a framework for grief, she said. Very few of them match the actual experience. What matches? She thought about it. It's quiet, she said. The actual thing. Not dramatic. You don't feel enormous things constantly. You feel nothing for stretches, and then something ordinary sets it off. The song that played at the wrong moment. The way someone holds a coffee cup. She paused. For the first year, I couldn't look at men with black umbrellas. Daniel had a black umbrella. I saw one on the street and I had to sit down. Beckett said nothing. He looked at her the way she'd learned to understand his looking, not studying, but being present, actually receiving what was said. A cashier at the grocery store, he said after a moment. Laura used to organize the groceries on the conveyor belt by category. Cold things together, canned things together. Said it was more efficient at the other end. For 2 years I couldn't go through a checkout without watching what the person in front of me was doing. She nodded. Not the big stuff, he said, never the big stuff. Always the small things that weren't supposed to mean anything. Yes, she said. They sat with that for a moment, not in the way of a silence that needed filling, but in the way of two people who had just said something accurate about a hard thing and were letting it be accurate without rushing to the next sentence. The May light had gone by the time they left the restaurant. The walking path outside had evening people in it, couples, a man with a dog, 2 teenagers making the kind of noise that is itself the content. Seraphina and Beckett walked the half-block to where Marcus was waiting, and she was aware with the particular acuteness of attention you bring to things you know. You'll want to remember that the evening had been good. Not perfect, not smoothly resolved. She hadn't reached for his hand, and he hadn't offered, because they were both people who moved at the pace of what they meant, rather than the pace of what looked right. But good. Real and good. At the car, he stopped. Next time the kids want to come, he said. She looked at him. That's not a question. No, he said. It's not. All right, she said. He nodded, turned and walked back toward his truck, and she got in the car, and Marcus pulled out without asking anything, because Marcus had been driving her for 3 years and understood the taxonomy of her silences. Piper was awake when she got home. She was technically supposed to be in bed, but was very obviously on the couch with a book, which was the Piper version of being in bed. She looked up when Seraphina came in. How was dinner, she said. Good, Seraphina said. Just good? Very good. Piper considered this with the focused assessment of someone who understood that she was being given partial information and was deciding whether to request more. She decided apparently not to push. He texted Jamie, she said. Seraphina paused. Beckett did? Jamie texted me to say his dad texted him to say he got home safe. She shrugged, with the practiced nonchalance of a child trying to underplay something she found significant. I just thought you should know. Seraphina looked at her daughter. Piper was looking at the book she was not reading. Go to bed, Seraphina said. I know, Piper, I'm going. She stood, held the book against her chest. Mom. What? He's good, Piper said, simply as though reporting a fact. He's a good one. Seraphina looked at her daughter, at the 8-year-old face that had been, for 2 years, more careful than it should have been, and was now, incrementally, becoming less so. At the girl who had whispered something to a stranger in October and set everything that followed into motion as casually and permanently as dropping a stone into water. I know, she said. Okay, Piper said, and went to bed. June brought the Oversight Commission's preliminary findings. They were, as Wallace Trent had assessed they would be, significant. 31 months of account manipulation through the hedging vehicle represented a fiduciary breach that the Commission characterized as both deliberate and material, the specific language that distinguished fraud from error. Alistair's personal attorney released a statement the same afternoon expressing confidence in the full review process, which was the statement you released when confidence was the only thing you had left to release. The formal outcome would take more months. Seraphina's lawyers told her to expect a settlement offer before the end of the year. She told them to evaluate it when it came and not before. The investigation had come to feel by June like weather in the background. Present, real, continuing, but no longer the thing that shaped every decision. The company was running well. The foundation had distributed its first round of grants, including one to the Westbridge Veterans and Families Center that covered the facility's maintenance program for 2 years. Sandra had called Seraphina personally when the approval came through, and Seraphina had been in a meeting and had listened to the voicemail twice afterward in her car. The Saturdays had continued without interruption through the spring. Jamie had decided, by late May, that he wanted to be a marine biologist rather than a veterinarian, which Beckett reported with the same wondering bewilderment as before. Piper had begun teaching a simplified version of the invented card game to the vocational program participants, which had become a Friday afternoon fixture that Sandra had put on the official program schedule with the name Piper's Game that Piper found embarrassing and wonderful simultaneously. Dex, who had come in March with Harold, had become a permanent fixture in the corner armchair adjacent to Harold's, and they had begun a running disagreement about city politics that both of them appeared to find deeply satisfying. The center had, over the course of 7 months, become a place that Seraphina thought of not as a place she supported, but as a place she knew which was different, in the way that ownership of a thing was different from belonging to it. It was a Saturday evening in late June after a program day when Seraphina told him. The kids had been picked up Jamie to a friend's house for the night. Piper, with Mrs. Parked because Seraphina had a foundation board call at 8. The center was quiet, the last of the afternoon light coming long and warm through the courtyard windows. Beckett had been locking up the supply rooms. She'd been waiting near the front door with her bag and her coat, and she'd told herself she would say it simply, without constructing it. She said it simply, "I love you." He had come down the corridor and stopped when he heard her. He looked at her. I know the timing isn't clean," she said. "And I'm not asking for anything in particular right now. I've been holding it for a while, and I think it's more honest to say it than to keep managing it." He stood in the corridor and looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "You know?" "I know," he said again. "I've known for a while." He paused. "I love you too. I've been trying to find the version of saying it that wouldn't overwhelm everything else." "There isn't one," she said. "No," he said, "there isn't." She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening light moved across the floor between them, and outside a bus went by on Garner Street. And somewhere in the building the heating system registered its opinion, and nothing was resolved, and nothing was simple, and everything that was true remained complicated. And then he crossed the corridor, and she met him halfway, and he held her in the particular way of someone who has decided this is real, and is not flinching from it, not carefully, not performing it, just actually doing it, and she let herself be held, which was the harder half of the thing, and had been the harder half for 4 years. It lasted until her phone buzzed against his arm with the reminder for the 8 o'clock call. "You have to go," he said. "I have to go," she agreed, pulled back and looked at him. His shirt had a streak of something on the shoulder that hadn't been there this morning. His expression had the quality she'd seen only a few times open, without the usual layer of management, the way people's faces looked when they'd stopped deciding how to look. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. She left. The evening was warm, the longest days of the year stretching light into the hours that had been dark all winter. Called the foundation board and was present and precise and managed the call well. Got home, checked on Piper sleeping, made tea, and sat at the table, the same table, the 8 chairs, and did not feel the accusation of them. She felt, sitting there in the warm June kitchen with the windows open and her daughter asleep upstairs, something that she had no clean name for. Not happiness. Exactly, happiness was too simple for something that sat beside grief and imperfection, and the ongoing, complicated work of being a person who had already lost one large thing and was choosing, with full knowledge of what loss cost, to try again. Not happiness. Something truer than that. Something that had been there a long time before she named it, the way rivers are there before the maps acknowledge them. She sat with it. She didn't try to make it smaller or more manageable or more certain than it was. She left the lights on and went upstairs. And for the first time in 4 years, she did not check the lock on the front door twice before she went to bed. She checked it once. That was enough. The settlement offer arrived on a Thursday in September, 7 weeks after the Oversight Commission issued its final report. The report was 43 pages and used language that left very little room for interpretation. The Commission characterized the account manipulation as a sustained and deliberate breach of fiduciary duty, calculated to consolidate control over Crowell logistics through financial misrepresentation rather than legitimate governance. Alistair's personal liability was assessed at a figure that would require liquidating significant assets. 2 members of his legal team had already withdrawn from the case in August, which was the kind of signal that precedes a settlement. Offer the way clouds preceded weather. Seraphina read the settlement document in her office on a Friday morning with her general counsel, a woman named Brooke Haynes, who had been her attorney since the company's third year and had the particular quality of someone who had seen most of what litigation could produce and had stopped being surprised by any of it. The offer was structured partial restitution, a formal resignation from all positions connected to Crowell Logistics and its subsidiaries, a non-disparagement agreement, and a confidentiality clause that Brooke recommended they push back on. Confidentiality clause covers his conduct broadly, Brooke said. That's more protection than he's entitled to. Counter with a carve-out for the Oversight Commission's published findings, Seraphina said. Those are already public. He doesn't get to seal the record. He'll push back. Let him push back. She closed the document. The Commission's report is final regardless of what he agrees to sign. The carve-out just makes our position clear. Brooke made a note. There's also the question of the restitution figure. His team is coming in 20% below the Commission's assessment. Counter at the full assessment. That'll extend the negotiation by. I know, Seraphina said. Counter at the full figure. He spent 31 months doing this. He can spend a few more weeks negotiating. Brooke looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. It was not a disagreeing look. It was the look of someone confirming that the instruction was given by the person who had the authority to give it. Full figure, she said. Full figure, Seraphina said. The negotiation ran for 4 more weeks. The final settlement came in at the full assessment figure. The confidentiality clause was modified to include the carve-out. Alistair Vane signed on an October Tuesday without, as far as Seraphina's legal team could determine, any further statement or communication directed at her. She received the signed copy by email at 6:15 in the evening. She was in the kitchen at home, standing at the counter, making the kind of dinner that resulted from opening the refrigerator and committing to whatever was in there, regardless of whether it constituted a plan. She read the email, closed her phone, and went back to what she was doing. Piper appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, drawn by the sounds of something that might become dinner. What is that? She asked, looking at the pan. Vegetables, Seraphina said. Which ones? The ones that were in the refrigerator. Piper came and stood beside her and looked at the pan with the frank assessment of a 9-year-old who had developed, over the past several months of family dinners at the lakeside house, specific opinions about cooking. You need something else, she said. It's just vegetables. It's almost done. You could put eggs in it. I could. That's what Beckett does when there isn't enough of something. He adds eggs and calls it a frittata. He calls it that? He spells it wrong when he writes it on the board. Piper pulled herself up onto the counter beside the stove, which she was technically not supposed to do, and which Seraphina had stopped formally prohibiting because the battle had a cost-benefit ratio that no longer made sense. The settlement thing. It's done? Seraphina looked at her. You know about that? I heard you and Brooke talking last week. I wasn't eavesdropping. The door was open. The door was open, Seraphina agreed, which was its own conversation. So it's done? It's done. Piper was quiet for a moment, swinging her feet against the cabinet below. Are you relieved? Seraphina thought about the word, whether it was accurate, what it sat next to. Yes, she said. Not nay, it doesn't feel like winning. Feels like something that needed to be finished is finished. That's not the same as winning? Winning implies someone loses dramatically, Seraphina said. This is more like a door closing. You close it, and then the room is different. Piper considered this with the serious concentration she brought to things she was filing away for later. Is the room better? Yes, Seraphina said. The room is better. Good, Piper said. She slid off the counter. I'll get eggs. They had moved into the lakeside house in August. The decision to sell the mansion had not been impulsive, though it might have appeared that way to people who measured decisions by how long they took rather than how long they had been forming. Seraphina had been aware, for most of a year, that the Westbridge house was the wrong container for the life she was building. It was not that she couldn't afford it, or that it was poorly made, or even that it held too much of the past in its walls. Those would have been simpler reasons. The real reason was simpler than all of them. The house had been designed for a certain kind of life, and she was no longer living that life. And continuing to live in it was a form of argument with herself that she'd decided to stop having. She had looked at properties for 3 months before finding the lakeside house in the town of Keller's Crossing, 20 minutes from Westbridge. It was not a billionaire's house. It was a substantial house, 4 bedrooms, a wide porch that faced the water, a garden that had been honestly neglected rather than photogenically distressed, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in. It had been owned by a family who had used it, which meant it had the specific lived-in quality of a place that had been touched consistently rather than maintained at careful remove. Piper had walked through it and said within 10 minutes, this one. Seraphina had said they should see the others on the list. Piper had said this one. They had seen the others. They had come back to this one. Beckett and Jamie had helped move boxes on a Saturday in early August, not because they'd been formally recruited, but because Beckett had said, when Seraphina mentioned the moving date, we'll be there. And then they had been 8 in the morning, with coffee and without needing instruction. Jamie had carried boxes with the systematic efficiency of a boy who had inherited his father's relationship to physical work not reluctantly, but as a natural mode of being useful in a space. Piper had supervised the placement of things in her room with the absolute authority of someone who had been waiting a long time for a room that was fully hers. By 6 in the evening, most of what needed to be inside was inside. The boxes were stacked imperfectly and would take 2 weeks to fully unpack, and the kitchen was in a state that could charitably be called transitional. Beckett had made sandwiches from what he'd found in the grocery bag Seraphina had packed, and the 4 of them had eaten on the porch steps because there was nowhere to sit yet, and the lake at the end of the property had caught the late August light in the way that bodies of water caught light at the end of a long day generously, without restraint. Jamie had looked at the lake for a long moment and said, "You could kayak on that." "We don't have kayaks," Piper said. "You could get them," Jamie said. This was not a suggestion. It was information. Beckett had looked at Seraphina and said nothing, but his expression said something, and she understood it, the quiet, specific pleasure of watching children encounter a thing they wanted before they knew they wanted it. The house had required adjustment, the way all real things required adjustment. Mrs. Park had come 3 days a week rather than full-time, because the house was smaller and because Seraphina had decided she was willing to cook dinner more often, which produced results that ranged from acceptable to genuinely bad and occasionally, without reliable pattern, surprisingly good. Piper left drawings on every horizontal surface. The garden, which they had committed to not professionally redesigning, had been dug up in 2 sections by Piper and Jamie in September, with the stated intention of planting things, and whatever they planted would either grow or not, and that was going to be fine. Beckett came on Saturdays and sometimes Sundays. Jamie came with him, which meant Piper and Jamie occupied the same general orbit they had at the center, now expanded to include the lake and the improbable garden project, and a long section of porch where they had established, without discussion, that board games were a different category of activity than card games and had different rules about arguing. He didn't move in. That was not where they were, and both of them understood the difference between what was true and what was next without needing to map it precisely. But he was there often enough that Jamie had a drawer in the spare room, a practical accommodation arrived at. After the 3rd time, a toothbrush needed to be procured, and Beckett knew where the coffee was and how the back door latch worked and which of the porch boards was starting to soften. Because he had assessed the porch the 2nd time he came and told her about the board, and then fixed it the 3rd time, without being asked, because that was how he moved through spaces he cared about. It was a Saturday in October, 1 year almost to the week from the morning. Piper had walked into the Veterans Center and sat beside a man on a ladder that Beckett asked her to come back to the center with him. Not for a program day, not for a meeting or a grant review or anything operational. He had simply said, the previous week, come to the center next Saturday. Bring Piper. And when she'd asked why, he'd said, there's something I want to do there. She had learned, over 12 months, that he did not elaborate when he didn't want to, and that pressing him produced no additional information and mildly disrupted his composure in a way that she had stopped finding worth it. She said all right. On Saturday morning, the weather cooperated in the way that October weather in Westbridge sometimes did, cool and bright. The kind of light that made ordinary things look like they'd been reconsidered. She and Piper drove in separately from Beckett and Jamie, which was not unusual. Marcus had been driving Seraphina less. Since the move to Keller's Crossing, another adjustment, gradual and unannounced, the perimeter of her life becoming both smaller and somehow less constrictive. When they arrived at the center, Sandra was there, and Carla from the welding program, and Harold and Dex in their corner chairs, and Frank and perhaps 15 other people who used the center a loose assembly that Seraphina initially took for a regular gathering, before she noticed that it was a Saturday without a scheduled program, and that everyone was in the main hall rather than dispersed through the building. Sandra caught her eye across the room. Her expression was the composed, containing expression of someone who knows what is happening and has been asked to know it quietly. She gave Seraphina the briefest nod. Seraphina looked at Piper. Piper looked around the room with the specific alertness of a child who processes social texture faster than most adults. She didn't say anything. Beckett and Jamie came through the front door 2 minutes later. Jamie was wearing a collared shirt, which was unusual enough that Piper noticed it immediately and raised an eyebrow at him. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told to wear it and wasn't going to explain further. Beckett found Seraphina across the room. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for a year, now the same direct, unhurried look, but with something beneath it today that she could read without being able to name precisely. He went to the table in the center of the room. On it were 2 small boxes, which Seraphina had not noticed when she'd come in, because they were the size of things that sat quietly and waited to be approached rather than presenting themselves. She understood, looking at them, what was about to happen. The room had not gone theatrical. It had not gone quiet in the performed way of rooms waiting for a moment. It had simply settled the natural settling of people who know something is real and want to be present for it without interrupting it. Beckett picked up both boxes, and then he did the thing she had not anticipated. Turned toward Piper first. He walked to her daughter, the 9-year-old in the yellow jacket she'd worn the first day, who had walked into this building a year ago and sat beside a stranger on a ladder, and set every subsequent thing in motion, and he crouched down to her eye level, the way he had crouched on the first day, so they were face to face. Piper looked at him. Her expression had gone very still, in the way that children's faces went still when they understood that something was serious and real and addressed directly to them. He held out the smaller of the 2 boxes. She took it and opened it. Inside was a small silver compass. It was not flashy, not the kind of thing that announced itself. It sat in its case with the quiet weight of something made to be held rather than displayed. Engraved on the back, in clean small letters, were 4 words: "You help me find home." Piper looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Beckett. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it clearly." His voice was even and careful, the same voice he used when he was saying something he needed to get right. "Your father was here first. He'll always have been here first. I'm not going to ask you to forget him, or put him somewhere smaller, or make room for me where he already is. I'm not going to try to be what he was, because I can't be, and it wouldn't be honest to try." He paused. "What I can tell you is that I'm not going anywhere. I've chosen you and your mom as the people I want to be around, both of you, together, the whole difficult ongoing thing of it. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend a long time trying to be useful to you." Piper said nothing for a moment. Her jaw was tight in the way it went when she was holding something in. Then she said, "You already are." He looked at her. "Useful," she said. "You already are." He nodded once slowly. And then Piper did something that Seraphina would not have predicted and would never forget. She stepped forward and put her arms around his neck with the unguarded completeness of a child who has decided to stop being careful about something, and Beckett held her the way. He held things he intended to keep firmly without performance. When they separated, Piper was holding the compass in both hands. She looked at it for another moment, and then she closed her fingers around it. Beckett stood. He turned to Seraphina. He opened the second box. The ring was simple, not understated in the way that gestured toward minimalism, as a style actually simple, the simplicity of something made for a specific person without needing to make a point about itself. It was the right thing. She didn't know how he had known. She had never told him what she would have wanted, and yet it was the right thing. She looked at it, and then at him. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "You know what I mean." "You've known for a while." "I have," she said. "And you know what this costs," he said. "Both of us. We know exactly what it costs, which is a thing most people don't have the information to know when they do this." "We do," she said so. He looked at her steadily. "Seraphina." She looked at Piper, who was holding the compass against her chest and wearing the same open, enormous smile she had worn in October, a year ago, the one that had first appeared when a stranger had told her that her mother only needed one man smart enough to see what everyone else had missed. The same smile, 1 year older, with a year's worth of burnt pancakes and lost baseballs and hard conversations and Saturday mornings and the back porch of a lakeside house behind it. Seraphina looked back at Beckett. "Yes," she said. The room breathed. Not dramatically, there was no choreographed applause, no theatrical moment. Harold said something to Dex that was probably not about the proposal at all. Sandra pressed her lips together in the way of someone containing a significant amount of feeling and doing it imperfectly. Frank's face did the thing that old men's faces did when they'd seen enough of life to know that the ordinary moments were where the real things happened. Beckett put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. Hers were not entirely, and she did not try to make them be. Jamie, who had been standing nearby with the contained expression of a boy who had known this was coming and had decided how he felt about it over the past several weeks, came and stood beside Piper. They looked at each other with the particular sideways look of two children absorbing the same piece of news from different angles. So Jamie said. "That makes us," Piper said. He appeared to consider this. "Okay," he said. "Yeah," she said again. And then they went to get food from the table Sandra had set up, because they were children and they had processed the important information and were ready to move on, which was both the most honest response and the most correct one. The wedding was in November, on a Saturday, in the garden behind the center. Seraphina had looked at 3 other venues. She had gone to the Westbridge Grand Hotel, not the gala floor, a different wing, and walked through it, and thought about what it would look like in photographs, and understood immediately that she did not want something that looked like anything in particular. She had looked at a vineyard outside the city and a historic house that was available for events. All of them were beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with her life. The garden behind the center was not beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her life. It was where she had stood in the cold October air and heard Beckett describe what he thought the threat was and what he intended to do about it. It was where Piper and Jamie had thrown a baseball against the fence for the first time and established the terms of their friendship. It was where she had stood with a coffee cup in both hands, not talking about grief but talking near it, which was sometimes the closest you could get and was enough. She chose it without explaining the reasons, because the reasons were the kind that don't reduce well to words. They married us a Saturday afternoon in late November, when the garden had gone to winter dormancy and looked like what it was, a real garden at the end of a growing season rather than a stage set for an event. Sandra had strung lights along the fence. The folding chairs from the main hall were set up in 2 sections with an aisle between them. Harold and Dex occupied the end chairs on either side with the solemn authority of men who understood that bearing witness was a legitimate function. There were 60 people. Seraphina had started with a list of 200, built from the categories her previous life would have populated a wedding guest list with company contacts, board members, investors, the extended orbit of professional relationship that constituted a social world when work was the primary world. She had cut it and cut it again, and ended with 60 people who were actually part of her life rather than her professional landscape. The process had been clarifying in ways she hadn't expected, each cut revealing something about the difference between people who were present in her calendar and people who were present in her life. Beckett had started with a shorter list. He invited the people he trusted, which was a number that could be counted on 2 hands, and some of the center's regulars, and a handful of men he'd served with who had arrived from various states with the efficient, minimal luggage of people accustomed to traveling at short notice, and who would have found anything more than a folding chair and a clear view excessive. Jamie stood beside his father in a collared shirt and a tie he'd agreed to wear under quiet negotiation. He stood straight, not stiffly, the posture of someone who understood the gravity of the occasion and was present for it without being consumed by it. He had his father's quality of occupying space without announcing it. In 10 years, Seraphina thought he would be a remarkable person. He already was. Piper walked down the aisle. Not with a flower basket, she had declined the flower basket with the specificity of someone who had considered it and found it not to be her. She walked with the silver compass in one hand, carrying it the way she carried things she intended to keep, and she was wearing the yellow jacket that had by now been replaced twice because she kept outgrowing it, but was on its 3rd iteration, because she had simply kept asking for the same jacket in the new size. She walked to the front and stood beside Seraphina and looked at Beckett with the 9-year-old equivalent of telling him he'd better not mess this up, which was also the 9-year-old equivalent of telling him she trusted him completely. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. The ceremony was brief and honest. The officiant, a woman named Judge Clara Voss, who had married people for 20 years, and knew the difference between ceremony and performance, kept it simple. Seraphina and Beckett had written their own words, and the words were not elegant because they had not aimed for elegant. They had aimed for true. They said the things that were actually true, that they understood what they were doing, that they had arrived here from loss rather than from innocence, that they were not promising perfection or ease, but presence, the specific, stained intention of showing up day after day for the difficult, ordinary thing. They did not pretend that the people they had lost were absent. At one point in the ceremony, without planning it as a formal moment, Beckett said, "Daniel and Laura were here first. They'll always have been here first." He said it simply, the way he'd said it to Piper in the main hall, and nobody in the garden made a sound. Seraphina had thought she would hold it together at that moment. She had been wrong. It was not grief, exactly. Or not only grief, it was the feeling of being known in a place you hadn't known could be reached. Of having someone see the whole map of you, including the part that was still marked by who you'd lost, and say, "I see that. I'm not asking you to fold it away." She had not held it together. She had held his hands, and he had held hers, and they had both stood in the imperfect November garden in front of 60 people and said what they meant. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The four of them moved through the winter that followed with the specific chaos of a household that had been assembled from two separate households and had not yet arrived at a unified theory of how things were done. This produced, on any given week, a number of minor conflicts. The question of where shoes went when you came in the back door, which Beckett felt strongly about and which Jamie appeared constitutionally unable to honor. The question of whether the coffee was kept in the cabinet above the machine or the one beside it, which Seraphina and Beckett had resolved through a compromise that satisfied neither of them. The question of which television in which room was designated for which purpose, which Piper and Jamie had sorted out through a negotiation that had taken 2 evenings and produced a formal document that Piper had written by hand and both of them had signed. Beckett cooked Sunday breakfast with the sincere, sustained optimism of a man who believed that the next attempt would be better than the last. It usually wasn't. The pancakes were a recurring sight of ambition and disappointment. Jamie ate them without complaint because that was what you did with food someone had made for you. Piper ate them and provided commentary, which she considered helpful, and which it occasionally was. Seraphina had learned that the correct move was to eat quickly and compliment the effort rather than the product. And Beckett had learned that she was doing this, and they had arrived at an unspoken agreement that the Sunday breakfasts would continue in their current imperfect form indefinitely, because the imperfection was not, in fact, the problem. She had restructured her schedule at the company in September, before the wedding. Not dramatically, she was still the executive that the company required, still present for the decisions that required her. But she had hired a chief operating officer for the first time, a methodical woman named Renata Ferris, who had run a logistics operation in the Pacific Northwest for 8 years, and who understood, when Seraphina said the company needed a second person who could make real decisions, that this was a trust statement rather than an abdication. The board had approved it unanimously. Patricia Osei had said afterward, "I wondered when you'd do that." "Did it take too long?" Seraphina asked. "It took exactly as long as it needed to," Patricia said, which is the only timeline that matters. The foundation had distributed its second round of grants in the fall, expanded to include a program supporting widowed parents with young children, not through grief counseling or prescribed framework, but through practical support, childcare, legal assistance, financial literacy, the things that disappeared at the same time the person did. Seraphina had designed the program's framework herself, in the evenings, over about 6 weeks, drawing on nothing more expert than her own experience and the experiences of people she had talked to who had lived similar things. She was not a social worker. She was not a policy expert. She was a person who had needed specific help at a specific time and had found that the help available was organized around what people assumed grief looked like rather than what it actually required. The program was imperfect. The first cohort had found 2 gaps in the framework within 4 months, which Seraphina fixed. Third gap appeared in month 7, which she fixed more slowly because it required a funding mechanism she hadn't anticipated. Perfection was not the goal. The goal was for the thing to work, and it did, not smoothly and not completely, but it worked. It was a January evening, 3 months after the wedding, when Piper asked him about the whisper. They were on the back porch of the lakeside house. It was too cold to be on the porch by any rational assessment, but Beckett had built a fire in the outdoor pit, and the four of them had migrated there after dinner with blankets and the remains of a dessert that Jamie had selected at the grocery store based entirely on packaging, which had turned out to be an acceptable selection method. The lake was dark. The fire was adequate. There was an argument brewing between Piper and Jamie about something that had happened during a board game 2 hours earlier and had not been resolved, but it was simmering rather than active. Piper was sitting beside Beckett, which she did often now without calculation, the way children sat beside people they trusted, simply because the space was there and the person was in it. "Do you remember what I whispered to you?" she asked, the first day. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "All of it?" "Every word." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the fire for a moment. "I was wrong," she said. "About what I said." He looked at her quietly. "I said nobody would want to marry a widow like my mom." She said it the way she'd been thinking about it, revisiting the architecture of the original statement. But that wasn't really the problem. The problem was she thought it was true. He nodded slowly. "So I wasn't wrong about the problem," she said. "I was just wrong about where the problem was." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You were 9, 8, she corrected. 8. You saw something most adults would have talked themselves out of seeing." He paused. "You did the thing people are supposed to do when they see something true. You said it out loud, even if the words weren't perfect." Piper considered this. "You said she just needed one man smart enough to see her." "I remember. Did you know then that you were going to be that person?" He shook his head. "No. I knew I could see her. I didn't know what I was going to do with that." Piper looked out at the lake. "I think that's why I told you," she said. "Because you looked like someone who would do something with it." The fire made its sounds. Jamie had finished his dessert and was doing the thing he did when he was thinking, tipping his head slightly to one side, looking at something that wasn't the thing he was thinking about. Seraphina came through the back door with more coffee and a second blanket, assessed the porch situation, and added the blanket to Piper's pile without comment. She sat down on the other side of Beckett. He put his arm around her. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "The first day," Piper said. Seraphina looked at her daughter over Beckett's chest. There was a quality to Piper's face in the firelight that was both 9 and older than 9, simultaneously the face of a child who had lost something large early and had incorporated the loss, rather than being defined by it, who was still in the process of figuring out what she was going to become, which was the process all children were in, only more visibly. "What about it?" Seraphina said. "I was telling him he got the hard part right," Piper said. Seraphina looked at Beckett. "She's not wrong," he said. The four of them sat in the cold and the firelight. 4 people who had arrived at this particular porch from 4 different directions, all of them carrying what they carried. None of it put down, but all of it arranged differently, now less like weight and more like ballast, kind that keeps a ship true in rough water rather than dragging it under. Seraphina thought, sitting there, about what she would have said if someone had described this evening to her 2 years ago: the porch, the fire, the children arguing about a board game that had ended hours ago, the man beside her who had fixed the softboard and knew where the coffee was and had said, on a November afternoon in a garden, that he was not asking her to fold anything away. She would have said it sounded like something that happened to other people. That was the thing she had most needed to be wrong about. The understanding she had arrived at slowly, imperfectly, over the course of a year of Saturday mornings and hard conversations and one terrifying night and 60 people in a cold garden, was that the future was not something you could design your way into. She had spent a decade designing things, companies, structures, frameworks, systems. She was good at it. It was real and useful work. But the life she was sitting inside right now, on this particular porch, had not been designed. It had been found by a child who walked into a building she wasn't supposed to enter, by a whisper overheard on a sidewalk, by the slow accumulation of ordinary Saturdays until ordinary became something else, and then something else again, and then this. The world had known Seraphina Crowell as a billionaire who possessed almost everything. The world measured its definitions of possession in buildings and figures and the clean lines of power. Her daughter had known something different, had known it before anyone said it, before it had a shape, before it was anything more than a feeling she'd had watching her mother be careful for too long. She had walked into a veterans center and found a man on a ladder and decided with the uncomplicated clarity of a child who sees what she sees and names it that this was the place. She had been right, not because it had been easy. Not because anyone had been saved from anything, exactly the grief was still there. In the distance Beckett described, further away but not gone. And the mistakes were still in the record. And the company still had days that required everything she had. And the pancakes on Sunday morning were going to be bad again next week. But because hard things and good things were not opposites, and never had been, and the only life worth having was the one you were willing to enter with full knowledge of what it cost. You did not get to know, when you walked into something real, whether it would hold. You just walked in. Piper had done that at 8 years old. Had walked into a building and sat beside a stranger and said what was true, even when the truth was the kind that made you feel exposed to say it. That was the whole lesson. Not that love solved things, or that the right person appeared, and the difficulty stopped. But that someone seeing you, really seeing you, the whole incomplete, difficult map of you changed the acoustics of the room. That being known by one person who chose to keep knowing you was not a small thing. The thing that made the rest of the room bearable, and sometimes more than bearable, and occasionally, on a porch in January with a fire that was going out, and children arguing about a board game that nobody was going to officially win, something that felt, against all of its own evidence of imperfection, entirely enough. Piper's head dropped against Beckett's arm. She was not asleep. She was the kind of child who resisted sleep on principle, but she was close. The way people got close to things they weren't quite ready to concede. Jamie had stopped his private thinking and was now looking at the lake with the focused attention of someone planning something. Seraphina suspected the planning involved kayaks. She had not committed to the kayaks yet. She was going to. Fire's going out, Beckett said. I know, Seraphina said. Neither of them moved. The lake held the dark, and the fire made its last small arguments, and the four of them stayed on the porch a little longer, not because there was nowhere to go, but because this was where they were, and where they were had become, quietly and without announcement, exactly where they wanted to be.